For those people in the audience or watching, I would like to explain why we are starting a few moments late. We started this afternoon with a work session over at the Fairfax County Government Center, and that work session ended shortly after 5, and the rest of our board members are making their way from the Government Center, and a couple of them are caught on 66. So I apologize for our starting a few minutes late, but we felt that it was very important to go ahead and schedule this meeting for today, or for this evening. Okay, so we will go ahead and call this meeting to order. Good evening, everybody. I just want to make a couple of comments before we get started. Fairfax County Public Schools prides itself on its caring culture, and we are committed to ensuring all of our children are treated with care and dignity in an environment that supports their needs to help them learn and grow. I believe I speak for all of our board members when I share with you this evening that recent media reports, testimony, the SEPTA survey, and stories we have heard from parents on restraint and seclusion of students have been very concerning for each and every one of this board's members. We appreciate the work of the Special Education PTA and other advocates who have shed light on this very important issue. Parents and guardians, we hear you. We feel your pain and understand your worries. We understand that when a child is in pain or experiences trauma, the whole family experiences this trauma. It's appropriate that we are opening up this dialogue today on National Autism Awareness Day. It is a day when we recognize and bring awareness that each child with autism is likely to have a unique pattern of behavior and a level of severity, and we must stand up for each of these children. We understand that these are difficult and complex issues, and we are committed to working with advocates, parents, and our staff to find solutions that are implemented with fidelity across the system. As a board, we have directed the superintendent to initiate a thorough and independent review of our restraint and seclusion practices and procedures to include parental notification, data collection and reporting, and staff training to ensure that we are using the best practices for behavior management and de-escalation techniques to support our children. That work has just begun. We understand that the need to address the concerns of our community and identify ways to improve in both a deliberate and thoughtful manner, as well as with a sense of urgency. And I believe that our work this evening will provide a path forward, which will enable us to better meet the needs of our students and families and the staff supporting these students while increasing transparency and accountability. Tonight's session is the beginning of a process of understanding how we got to where we are and identifying what we need to do to address the concerns of our community. Tonight, staff will present to us information on current practices and data related to restraint and seclusion and recommend some initial next steps. As a board, we will have an opportunity to ask questions and discuss these critical issues. And with that, I will ask Dr. Brabrand to begin the presentation. Oh, actually, before we do that, I do want to give the opportunity for Ms. Derenak-Kofax to make a comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think your comments were exactly where the majority of this board is. I just want the public to know and my colleagues to know that I have, for several months now, had a budget committee a budget forum topic, or a budget community meeting, I should say, with Supervisor McKay in the Lee District. So I will be leaving this meeting momentarily, but I will be watching it after this meeting is complete. And I want the public to know that I am here for you, to listen to you, and anything you need to. I want to be there as your advocate, but. Again, this is, as you said, Ms. Sanders, it's the beginning of a process for us, and we look forward to partnering with everyone to move this in the best direction for all of our children.
Thank you, Ms. Derenak-Kofax. And with that, Dr. Brabrand, would you like to start the presentation?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We appreciate the opportunity to be here at this work session this evening. around restraint and seclusion, and I want to begin with an overview of why we're here. We here are at a critical moment of trust in our community and in our school system. This issue of trust is directly tied to our policies and practices around restraint and seclusion. Leaders must define reality and offer solutions and a way forward. It is clear that as a system, we have fallen short in this area. Parents have shared their concerns with us about our restraint and seclusion procedures, how they are applied, if we are following our own guidelines, and whether our school-based personnel are adequately and properly trained. In addition, we discovered that we have been remiss in our data collection and data reporting requirements for many years. I want to acknowledge that my initial public response did not adequately take full responsibility and ownership of these issues, nor did they include a plan to address the concerns that were noted. And for that, I am fully responsible. Tonight, though, is a first step, but an important step for me and my leadership team as we seek to address the concerns raised, not just explaining where we are, but offering solutions that can move the system forward in a caring and inclusive way. How will we improve? In this presentation, we'll bring needed transparency so that we can educate the board and the community about our practices. We will recommit to review our training, ensure a systematic application of this training to our faculty and staff. We do have tremendous administrators, teachers, and support staff in Fairfax County Public Schools. They must, however, have the opportunity to be provided with the appropriate training to support and serve all students well. We will also review how well our practices align or don't align with national best practices. We will audit all our elementary school comprehensive service sites, which you'll learn a little bit more about later, and public day programs to ensure compliance with state and federal laws along with our own guidelines. We will transparently share our data and will commit to addressing the incorrect reporting of our instances of restraint and seclusion to the federal government. We're also committed to looking at this data through an equity lens, as we've been looking at all data over this last year to determine if there's disproportionality in who is restrained and secluded. How will we engage our community? We will listen to parents, some of who are here tonight and those listening, to stakeholder groups, and to the Fairfax County School Board. I want to thank those parents who've fiercely advocated for their children and for bringing their issues and stories to the forefront so that they receive the attention and focus that are long overdue. We will partner with stakeholder groups to explore best practices and training procedures. We'll also engage with our own teachers and principal associations on successful practices. I want FCPS to become a model for school districts across the country in how we do this specific work and how we treat our students with disabilities. And this will only happen if all voices are heard. Finally, a timeline for improvement and engagement. In our presentation, you will note that along with our initial recommended process improvements, we'll provide a timeline for this board and community to look at that includes stakeholder communication and engagement. In closing, I will say that we know our parents trust schools to provide an environment in which students can learn and grow by being led by kind and caring professionals. I know that for some parents, that trust has been broken. As superintendent of Fairfax County Public Schools, I am responsible for every single child in this system by name and by need. I pledge to you tonight that I and our entire leadership team in this system and schools will work collaboratively and in partnership with this board and community to heal the hurt and systematically address these concerns around restraint and seclusion. It's now my privilege to introduce to you our Assistant Superintendent for the Department of Special Services, Teresa Johnson, and she will be introducing her team who will begin the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Brabrand. Before we get started, I just wanted to say that Dr. Francisco Duran, our Chief Equity Officer, was unable to be here tonight, and on his behalf, I know he really wanted to be present, was just not able to. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask my staff to introduce themselves and just share a little bit about their position.
Good evening. I'm Jane Strong. I'm the Director for Special Education Procedure Support. And so in our area, we are responsible for training and support to our schools and families around IEP's eligibility and compliance with special education regulations. We also have our multi-agency services department and the due process and eligibility support team.
Good evening. My name is Mike Bloom, and I'm the Acting Director of Special Education Instruction. And our team supports all of the instructional and behavioral programming for students with disabilities in all schools, pre-kindergarten through grade 12. So that includes our early childhood special education services. It also includes all of our related service providers, as well as our instructional staff and behavioral staff.
Hello, I'm Tina Wilkerson, and I'm the coordinator of Applied Behavior Analysis. I support the preschool autism classrooms, the enhanced autism classrooms, and then the Cat B secondary program. Along with that, I supervise the ABA coaches that also support those classrooms.
Okay, with that, I want to thank you again for the opportunity to share our presentation tonight. We're going to start tonight to share information about our data collection and reporting, our notification processes, and our recommendations for how we will improve. In order to systematically address our concerns, it's important to begin with the review of our data. The charts on the screen represent our preliminary data from 2017-18. Table A represents the number of students, general ed and special ed, who were restrained or secluded during the school year 2017-18. Table B shows the total number of instances of restraint and seclusion for a total of 1,679. This number, this 1,679, please keep in mind, reflects students who may have had incidents in either restraint and or seclusion. So while the percentages of students impacted, you can see from the chart, overall is low, we recognize the impact these actions may have had on our students, and we take every one of these instances seriously. Again, the numbers above represent preliminary data that will be reported to the Office of Civil Rights for the Civil Rights Data Collection for the 2017-2018 submission on April 22nd, 2019. It's important to understand that seclusion and restraint may occur on a continuum and therefore may occur in the general ed setting. FCPS offers special education services to all of our students in FCPS schools, many providing services along the continuum of special education. In an elementary setting, a seclusion area may be set up in a classroom to support a student experiencing aggressive or self-injurious behaviors. Or seclusion may involve incidents when a classroom has to be cleared of students due to one student's dangerous behavior with an adult present in the room. Our public day programs are considered standalone facilities that provide the highest level of special education support. You can see those schools listed above. Comprehensive services sites also provide high levels of special education support, and they are located within our schools. Restraint and seclusion should be used only as a last resort for safety, only if there is imminent danger for the student or others. Other research-based alternatives to behavior management should be utilized first to address student behavior. Currently, there is no VDOE reporting requirement. We do expect this to change with the proposed Virginia regulations this summer. FCPS has been required to report restraint and seclusion data to the Office for Civil Rights for the Civil Rights Data Collection since 2009-2010. This data is reported every other year. In 2009, 2010, and 2011, 2012, FCPS did not have a collection process in place. For those years, FCPS reported zeros in the CRDC report. In 2012, the FCPS Restraint and Seclusion Guidelines were developed, and a manual data collection process was instituted. For the school year 13-14 and 15-16, a manual or paper form was collected centrally, yet there was not a system-wide data support system that was available in a reportable form. FCPS reported zeros in the CRDC report for those years. It is unclear as to why this decision was made under past FCPS leadership. However, FCPS will be submitting corrected data for 13-14 and 15-16. And because this has been a manual collection process, it may take some time to collate and review that data. Again, we will be submitting 17-18 data that was shared with you on the previous slide, and that will be on April 22nd, 2019. We acknowledge that the process of collecting and reporting data is an area that we need to address and improve upon.
I want to take a moment just to comment on what Ms. Johnson just shared. We will initiate in Fairfax County Public Schools an independent expert review of our data collection, our data reporting, our parent notification, our training, and our restraint and seclusion guidelines and practices. And this is not acceptable for Fairfax County Public Schools, this level of reporting. And we will do an independent review and we will address it.
Again, I want to reiterate that restraint and seclusion should only be used in a dangerous situation. Our own guidelines state that the use of physical restraint and seclusion in the management of severe student behavior is prohibited unless there is a dangerous situation and the seclusion or physical restraint is necessary to protect the student or another student or persons. The FCPS training that is provided to school staff is clear about what the expectations are and when to use restraint and seclusion. We know that restraint and seclusion is an issue that is affecting school systems across the state and across the nation. Education has moved into a more inclusive environment with the goal of educating our special ed students in their neighborhood schools or as close to home whenever possible. Best practices and research have evolved over time, and it's time for FCPS to make changes. Changes to our practices and changes to our culture. I want to transition now to discuss parent notification. Our current guidelines outline the following expectations that each school is expected to follow when a student is restrained or secluded. Notification requirements to parents follow this procedure. When a physical restraint or seclusion procedure has been implemented, FCPS guidelines outline the following actions to be taken by school. First, principal or designee will contact a parent or legal guardian. Notification must occur by the following day. School staff understands the importance of notifying the parent, and every effort should be made to notify parents the same day of the incident. We do expect the proposed Virginia regulations will require parent notification on the day of the incident that occurs. Attempts to contact parents must be documented. Contact by phone or other methods, including email, letter, or in person. And there's an additional requirement of providing a description of the incident, the time of day, the setting, the precipitating events, the preventative efforts, etc. And follow up as appropriate, whether that be an IEP meeting, a parent conference, or a meeting of the core team. FCPS notification procedures will be updated this summer of 2019 to align with revised guidance from the Virginia Department of Education. In addition to parent notification, when restraint or seclusion is implemented, the school administration is expected to follow the protocol listed on the slide. Complete the appropriate form, send a copy of the completed form to the parent, send a copy to the Director of Special Education Instruction, and place a copy in the student record. We recognize that the way schools are reporting, this manual process has resulted in inconsistencies across the division. The Department of Special Services and Information Technology are collaborating on the development of an electronic collection and reporting process that will be housed in the Student Information System we anticipate beginning 2019-20. This will enable schools and central office to document and review data in a more effective and efficient manner. FCPS has not had a systematic review process in place, and we are taking steps to change this practice. We have an opportunity and a need to improve our practices in the areas of parent notification and the central collection of data, and I am committed to improving these practices. So how will we improve? The first area we have identified for improvement is data collection and data processes. FCPS needs a stronger collaborative approach among offices to ensure accountability and follow-up with the schools. Moving forward, we will have a systemic oversight of restraint and seclusion data between the region offices and Department of Special Services on a quarterly basis. We have outlined FCPS process improvements for collecting and reporting of data above. 1, conduct an immediate audit of all elementary comprehensive service sites and public day programs related to restraint and seclusion practices. 2, complete...
Excuse me, Ms. Johnson,
Yes.
do you mind going
Oh, I'm
to
sorry.
Thank you.
Yes. For me. Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you. All right, number 1, I'll step back here. Conduct immediate audit of all of our our elementary comprehensive service sites and public day programs related to restraint and seclusion practices. Our second improvement would be strategic auditing of schools with patterns of high volume of reported incidents. For those school sites where the audit results from the 17-18 and 18-19 school years reveal patterns of high incidents of either restraint or seclusion, a more detailed and in-depth audit will be conducted. 3, a systematic review of restraint and seclusion data by school on a quarterly basis with leadership and Department of Special Services to be shared with Region Assistant Superintendent and office follow-up. And lastly, migration from a manual to an electronic process. We are now beginning a migration from a manual to an electronic process to be managed in our student information system. Again, this will allow for a more systemic management accountability of school-by-school data. Our second area of improvement is division-wide training. We will also be exploring at the same time best practices for keeping students and staff safe that are utilized by other school systems and school settings. To improve our training practices, we will require annual refresher training for all special education staff. Current training includes topics such as identifying positive approaches as appropriate responses to behavioral challenges, understanding IDEA requirements for addressing behavioral challenges through an IEP, identifying physical restraint and seclusion as emergency procedures, learning the appropriate procedures for the use of restraint and seclusion, and learning the appropriate documentation and reporting requirements. In addition, we will require all schools to have a crisis support team. A crisis support team includes at least 3 to 5 staff members trained in a crisis management system such as MANT. This team would have additional training and certified staff members who could address a student in crisis. Next, we will require training for general ed and paraprofessionals. This training will be the same training that special education staff receive, as I just mentioned above. We will develop updated training to meet new state requirements that we expect to be finalized by summer of 2019. We will develop annual training plans for comprehensive service sites and public day schools for behavior and crisis management, requiring the schools with students with higher behavioral needs to have a set plan for the school year to ensure all staff are receiving consistent training in areas such as ABA fundamentals, best practices for educating students with autism, positive behavior classroom management strategies, etc. Lastly, we will require trauma-informed education for all teachers. This would include sharing trauma-focused information about how student learning and behavior is impacted by trauma and how educators and support staff can help students develop a greater sense of safety at school. FCPS has increased the number of trauma-informed trainings that we've offered throughout the school system. And although many regions and schools have taken advantage of these trainings, participation has been optional for schools. Last fall, we began exploring ways to provide district-wide trauma-informed training to school staff. We anticipate having a training in place by fall for all staff, a similar format to the current suicide prevention that all staff currently receive. A third area for improvement is providing additional supports to be put in place for staff and parents. This will include the addition of 5 behavior intervention teachers pending budget approval for additional behavior and crisis management support and training for school staff. In the fall of 2018, we revamped our special education new teacher Great Beginnings program with more focus on building relationships and strategies for positive behavior approaches to classroom management. In addition, our stakeholder groups have reported a need to have an impartial avenue to ask questions, share concerns, and gather information about special education and FCPS. Therefore, we recommend that the board consider the addition of a special education expert to the Ombudsman's office. Our last area for improvement and most important is community engagement. It's important that we engage all of our stakeholder groups to review research-based best practices for behavior management and crisis supports for our schools and families. We've listed some stakeholder groups on the screen. However, this is not an exclusive list. We will continue to explore additional groups for outreach. Here is a timeline of our key actions. We anticipate that the Virginia Department of Education will finalize state regulations for restraint and seclusion this summer. At that time, we will be updating the FCPS guidelines and drafting a policy or regulation. Dr. Strong, our Director of Procedural Support, has been actively engaged at the state level, supporting the changes that have been proposed. On April 19th, FCPS will be submitting public comments in support of the many proposed changes. It is time to take a deeper dive into how we're doing things in Fairfax County Public Schools. We are committed to improving our practices, and we know that it's necessary to change the culture to a more accountable system to ensure fidelity of practice across the system. We appreciate that the community has brought forward, which has led us to take what the community has brought forward that led us to take a deeper dive into our practices and our processes. As educators, we want to protect all children in the classroom and the caring adults who work for them every day. As difficult as the last few weeks have been, it has brought to light areas which FCPS needs to strengthen to improve the quality of services for our schools. Thank you.
I just want to finish with saying that we know that one of our big elements in our strategic plan is a caring culture and honoring our values of a caring culture. In the strategic plan, it says that we commit to fostering a responsive, caring, and inclusive culture where all feel valued, supported, and hopeful. As I stated at the outset, our leadership team is committed to transparency around these issues and partnering with the school board, parents, stakeholder groups, and our employees to ensure all of our students are treated with the care and dignity that they need and deserve. And we'll be glad to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Brabrand. Before we continue on, I do want to extend the thanks from this board for the deliberate and intense amount of work that Dr. Johnson and your whole team have undertaken with your support, Dr. Brabrand, over the past couple of weeks. It is something that is very important. It's not something that, we knew was out there, and so we're very appreciative of the community bringing this to us, and we will continue to respond to the community in this area. A little bit later, I do want to talk a little bit about an idea that I had brought to the whole board, which is to establish a community of trust for our students with disabilities, similar to what is being done, what has been done in public safety on the county side. And that would be a group brought together to really ensure that we're responsive to the needs of this community, not only for this issue, but really in supporting the efforts to change our practices and our culture so that we proactively engage and understand what are the issues being faced and how we can best meet them. So with that, I do have a number of people who want to speak, starting with Ms. Schultz.
So that 3-minute better not apply to us tonight, because some of us are going to have more than 3 minutes.
Ms. Schultz,
So-
we're going to allow for go back, so 3 minutes in, and then we'll go back, okay?
I mean, look, this is, we called this meeting at the last minute. The agenda was not posted. I was checking at 11 o'clock this morning, and there were no materials posted. And this is a crucial issue that affects a huge percentage, not of our student population, but our parent population. There are a number of things that I'd like to discuss. Slide 3, if we could start with, for shock and awe that I'm a data-centric person. First of all, I know that a number of these changes have come at the urging of some of us, and so I appreciate the coming forward with the data. Let me ask for clarity since. So there's 203 affected students and 1,679 incidents. So that's 1,679 incidents, 530 of restraint, and 1,149 of seclusion are on those 203 students for an average of 8 per student, over 8?
No, there's no averaging. Those students could have multiple, those students have multiple incidents. So one student out of that 203 could have one, and one could have multiple.
That needs to stop when I'm getting an answer. On the notification to parents slide, you said FCPS guidelines. Is that FCPS policy? Because the guidelines, words have meaning. So is it policy? Is it regulation? Are they guidelines? Is it practice? Are there federal requirements that come along with parental notification? No, I'm just telling you, stop the clock when I get an answer. I'd like an answer.
So
I don't want
Ms.
to
Schultz,
ask a whole series of questions and then
and
wait
then I'll
for
stop
answers.
the clock as
Great.
you.
So we developed guidelines. So in 2012, there was no school board policy or regulation that was developed around these practices. There were guidelines developed.
So that means that we don't have an established board policy on this? Okay, so that's a next step. I'm going to ask for us to have a board policy. The public day and the CSS, I just want to make a point. Those are listed, if we could go to the slide where they're listed. Students are brought from all around the county. Those are not students that are specific to those schools. I want to add clarity to that because where those locations are is not indicative of how far the students have to go to travel to those, right? Okay. And the improvements on how we improve, with whom or to whom did you talk in order to decide how you were going to improve the process? I know some of us on the board made very specific requests, but did you go to ACSD? Did you go to SEPTA? I mean, how were the improvements decided upon?
So Ms. Johnson, I know, collaborated with the senior leadership and asked staff for input and plans to also continue collaborating with the different stakeholder groups, as was mentioned, the different advisory, SEPTA, so on, and others as identified.
I'd like to add to that. Shortly after the news story was shared, I did ask representatives from FCPTA, from SEPTA, and from ACSD to join me in my office with Ms. Johnson. We had a chance to talk. Obviously, feelings were raw right after this was being shared, but we did do a little bit of brainstorming, and from the brainstorming, one idea that there were several ideas and ideas shared, but that was a place where some of the things that you've seen as recommendations, like the ombudsman, having a specialist around special ed issues for that office, that's part of why they're in those recommendations.
Well, we've added the special ed person to each of the regions, and enhancing the region's role to the parents is crucial. I'm going to say on the caring culture, Dr. Braybrand, you said that this is not only about the need to treat students with dignity and care, it's also the parents. And this is what I see missing, is what have the parents' role been. ACSD has incredible insight into this. That's why it's a state-mandated advisory board to FCPS. And I think we need to not create new roles. I think we need to take advantage of that which is already state-mandated and use them. I mean, we were at a board meeting earlier today, and people talked about how SCIPT was created through a dust-up. And there was a problem with the Board of Supervisors and this school board, and SCIPT at first was very controversial, and it created a lot of problems, but it is through friction that change happens. And the respect of the parents bringing this forward has been the crucial missing part in the caring culture that I'd like to see returned, and I want to go back.
We're on the go back, I promise. Dr. Ivy.
Yes, I just would like to make a clarification for the board. The special education staff that has been added to the Office of School Support regional teams has the role of that particular staff member is for student achievement and instructional support.
I appreciate that, but if students are secluded and restrained, or we're in a constant battle with parents over an IEP, there's not a lot of achievement going on. So I think that the two are connected, but I understand, and we can follow up on that later.
Mr. Moon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for your hard work, even though I must confess that I was still disappointed that, we didn't get the material until sometime this afternoon. Because I wanted to take a look, give some thought, and perhaps send you some questions in advance. But I didn't have that opportunity. But that doesn't mean I do not value your staff working so hard during the last 2 weeks. And having said that, I have some questions to ask. That since I only have 3 minutes, I'm gonna go down pretty quickly. The slide number 3, we have numbers. Out of those 1,679 instances, how many were? Have you been able to determine how many of those been notified to parents, or you are still looking into that?
Those numbers were gathered off the forms that we have collected as a system. So I would not have confirmation. I would hope, because the documentation is supposed to be listed on the form, that every parent, but I can't confirm that, Mr. Moon.
Okay, would you be able to find those information later on and provide that to the school board, or that's not possible?
It would be difficult.
Okay, thank you. Because I know that we are trying to focus on what to do going forward, but in order for us to go forward in the best possible way, we need to know where we are, where we were. That is why I'm asking whether half of those were notified, or not even half, or all of those were notified. Because I, as one board member, need to know the truth so that we can make as we talk about policy, that we don't have, you're going to have one, I need to know the extent and gravity of the problems. With that, I know that I only have a minute left. So I am going to go to page 12 is some budgetary implications, but that doesn't seem to include a potential, a resource needs for training. We don't need any additional resources for training, to provide training, because as we are now in the middle of a budget deliberation season, and we will be discussing about budget amendments, then I think board members need to know. If you're going to be proposing on these recommendations, then need to know which components has what dollar figures attached. And I'm going to go quick. You don't have to answer that right now. You talked about changes to practices and culture. And then practices include notification and data collection. I think I can understand about data collection, but notification, I still don't get what our current practices is. And when you say culture, I still don't get what the culture is. And hopefully you can provide responses in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. I now have Ms. Hines, followed by Ms. Evans.
Thank you. I wanted to start by thanking our parent advocates who are here today, SEPTA leadership. Thank you. I think the survey in particular of parents has been extremely helpful. We all received the initial feedback that you got. And we know that this is a lot about data, but we have to look beneath the data to hear the voices of the parents to really understand why we're so concerned about this. So thank you. I understand that you also survey teachers, and I don't know if we've seen those results yet, but that will, okay, I'll make sure I find those, because that's equally important. You know, the voices matter. So I have 3 questions. I will shoot them at you, and then you can get back, you can answer if you can tonight. First is that the OCR data, that I understand that we're going back and finding the data and reporting what we can that we did not in the past. That's great. I hope that we are also taking a look at all of the hundreds of data points that we are supposed to report to OCR and making sure that we have not been amiss anywhere else. So I'd like a response to that. We're going to investigate that. Secondly, I think it was slide 11 where you used the term trauma-informed, and I just would like, if you don't mind, to define that. What trauma are we talking about? And then finally, my last question. There's been news about schools or school systems that have completely eliminated seclusion and restraint, and I'd like to know what we know about that so far and what we plan to do to follow up on that. Are they using different terminology, or are they using the same terminology that we use and actually have eliminated those practices? So those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay. OCR data, yes, we're looking at all the data. We had an extensive conversation about data points this week with Mary Beth Lefglass and the cabinet to really drill down, because we had some questions about reporting for other areas. So that's really Mary Beth's wheelhouse. Slide 11, trauma-informed training. If you'd like an in-depth conversation about that, we can certainly do that, or I could put it in next steps really about what it means, if that would be better. But your last question about other schools, I think that's important that maybe we have a little conversation and we share a little bit about that. We do have some knowledge of other programs, what are used in various programs, and we also Dr. Strong did research around the state about what the state is using for crisis management type programs. And we also, Tina Wilkerson has visited private sites such as Grafton to see what they're doing. And there's certainly some pros and cons about particular programs and how we manage those programs in a public school setting. So I do think we need to explore everything at this point so that we can and engage with some of our stakeholders and partnering to do that, and then take a look at what changes we might need to make to our crisis management type programs. Would you like Tina to address a little bit about any?
Well, if you have any useful information about, say, Grafton, if you visited there, because it's been in the news, the community is wondering why we can't do the same thing. So whatever we have.
So we've just started that investigation, and we are looking at their process of UCURU. And what they do is they use pads for both staff and then also around the student to help support them and they report a 1% restraint. Yeah, so that's really good information. I have seen it. Sometimes in looking at it, it does look like it hits our definition of seclusion. So that would be a piece we would need to look at, because the student is not always allowed to leave. There's a series of turns and kind of blocks that they use to help support the student staying safe and the staff staying safe.
Ms. Hines, are you complete? Finish. So I have Sandy Evans.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the presentation, and will say I do support
what you have here in terms of recommendations. I think you've given us a good range of things that you'd like to do, and I do support them. I see that you say it's pending with the behavior intervention teachers. Ms. Karen Keyes-Gamarra had an amendment for that, which I seconded, and so I certainly support that. I do believe that that was brought to us initially by advocates at our budget hearing, the need for that. And so, again, I want to thank our advocates for coming out and alerting us to that, because I don't think most of us on the board would have recognized that this was really an issue. So thank you for that, and I certainly hope we move forward with that. I also particularly support adding a special needs person in the Ombudsman's office. I believe a majority of the cases they've seen are special education cases. Is that correct? Do you know? I believe they are.
I do know there's been a high number. I'm not sure if it's been the majority, but definitely a high number.
Okay. So that would make sense to have a specialist in that office. So I'm particularly pleased to see that. And of course, the training. The training is critical. I do have a couple of questions for you as well. Going back to slide 3, I believe it is, with the numbers. I just want to be clear because of a question that Ms. Schultz asked. We are saying that the 1679, that it's 203 students, correct?
Yes, that's
Total,
correct.
Okay. Do you have a range of incidences? Presumably it would be from 1 to something. What's the highest number of instances?
We haven't delved quite that deep into the data, but that is something we could look at.
So I would ask for that as a next step, to have a sense of how many of those 203 students had one instance and what the highest number was. I would like to see that plotted out. So I would ask that as a next step. And then my other question for now is, with the OCR data, that I think we're all very disappointed that we didn't report the figures. Do we have those figures now tonight? What those figures should have been?
No, we're still working on the data for 13, 14, and 15, 16.
Okay,
It's going to take a little time.
We do have that in our timeline. Can we go to the timeline slide? We have committed tonight publicly and for the board. I just want to.
We're still collecting the data?
It's all manual, so
you're still.
We're going to need to go through all of.
We have all of the forms, and we have to go through every form. It's a process.
All right. Okay. All right. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Mr. McElveen, followed by Ms. Strauss.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we've talked a lot about community engagement tonight, and I think the community is interested not only in the initial outreach, the meetings you've had with them so far, and the meetings to come in the coming months, but how they will be engaged in a sustainable way moving forward on this issue. Because there is a long history. Many of the community members have brought to us that long history that's affected their families and others. So I think the community wants to see this not as a one-time chance to talk about this, but for an ongoing process. So I'd be eager to hear about that. My second question is the news that came to us tonight that I don't think the board was aware of, that we did not develop recommendation or regulations on seclusion and restraint until 2012. So I'd be eager to get a fuller understanding of why we did not have anything until 2012, when obviously this has been going on for a much longer time. Third, you spoke about preventative training in terms of dealing with the crises when they occur, but what kind of training are you going to be doing to avert the crisis before it emerges. And my final question would be, you discussed the audit of our practices, and my understanding, and I know the board's understanding, is that this is in fact going to be an external audit, which I think is critical for the community to understand. It's not going to be our internal auditor or folks inside the system doing it, but it's going to be an outside audit. And so going back to the issue of community engagement, how are the perspectives and experience of the community going to be gauged as part of that audit? And how is that being crafted in the RFP for the audit? I guess if you could tell us the timeline and the point at which the board will be able to see that audit, that would be very helpful. And I look forward to your responses on those 4 questions. Now. Yeah.
Okay. Just need some clarity there. I think we certainly need to have some conversation about what the long-term community engagement will look like. I welcome our chair's suggestions and ideas. I think it's fantastic, and we should explore that. I also think we need to continue our conversations and structures of our conversations with ACSD and SEPTA. We did not have guidelines. I can't answer why we had them. We did not have them before 2012. And let me just be clear, they're guidelines. We have not had a policy or a regulation ever. But I don't have an answer, and I think nobody on my staff is aware. We've been asking. So I don't have an answer for that. And training to avert a crisis, we certainly, either Mike Bloom or Sarah Kuhner back here or Tina Wilkerson could address what we currently do to address positive behavior supports and the trainings that we're offering, the strategies that are used, the ABA techniques that are used, the MANT training, which is a type of training that deals with de-escalation. What does the crisis cycle look like? How do you develop a relationship before there's any hands-on? So if you want specific details about that, we can certainly have any of them dig in and give you more details. And the audit practices, just let me clarify, Mr. McElveen, that when the external audit is different than the audits we're referring to in our slides here from the Department of Special Services perspective. We currently do extensive audits that include compliance and procedural as well as special ed instruction. They take quite some time and are very involved. Typically, we send whole teams into buildings to do that. I'm not sure if I've shared with you, but we've moved from used to be invitational, and I no longer allow those audits to be invitational. They are directed now if we see a need, and that has started in this past year. And really, the audits that we'd like to do with the CSS and public data for immediacy, we feel we need to do quick audits right now of some specific things that may or may not be happening related to restraint and seclusion practices in those programs. I hope that answers.
As far as the independent audit, I'm working with Division Counsel, and we're working on moving forward on the scoping and getting you the timeline. And I think we can have that in a couple more weeks of what the scope of that will be. Again, we've already broadly outlined it, but the specifics for the board and the timeline when that audit can be complete. So we can have that by the, what do you think, John, end of the month? Next 2 weeks? Okay, 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think we have some next steps out of that. But I do want to say that I think the board is confronting a problematic history here in that there is the appearance that many things have been swept under the rug, and there's been a pointing to prior administrations, prior school boards that did not look at this issue as they should have. But I do want to make it clear to the community, and I know my colleagues on the board feel the same way, is that we are not going to move forward without a full investigation of how this we got to this point with the faulty reporting, and which has now put us in a position of having to retroactively report. So this board is going to get to the bottom of why this has occurred. Thank you.
Ms. Strauss?
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate everybody's honesty and
putting together the steps that we need to take to move forward. So I appreciate that from all of you and from Dr. Braybrand and from our chairman, because I know that you've worked very hard in the last week answering the community concerns, and also after listening to the public input at the State Board of Education. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to look at this more closely. I also, in the report, the appendix is a very rich source of information. Since I was not with you earlier today, and I had an opportunity to actually read all the documents in detail. So the appendix, I do encourage everyone to take a look at it, and there are hot links that look at MAT and PCM, and it gives you a much, I think, clearer understanding of what we are talking about, particularly in what is seclusion, what is restraint, and what is not, because those definitions are very, very important as we move forward. One couple of questions as we are doing online data collection, which is very important because that's been part of the challenge with this. And we want our youngsters to obviously be available to learn and de-escalate and be ready to go. Will we, as we collect data in the way in which you envision it, obviously program by program, school by school, and we will obviously internally know how the children are doing. Will we be able to collect some of the data by age so that we can see progress in behaviors and how we will be held accountable for the progress in behaviors? We're not looking at passage of SOL test or things like that. We're looking at progress in behaviors. So I think that's going to be a very important, it's one of our struggles in the last 10, 15 years. We've spent a lot of time on standardized testing or other things for data points, and these children have significant needs, and there's new research, and there may be new ways to approach this, but we need to be able to look at their individual progress within these 200 children, aside from other ways that we are evaluating kids. My last question is, will the state be offering more help with additional funds for placement in schools such as Grafton, places like that? Because we do see children with significant needs. Is the state discussing perhaps offering to help? Question. My time is up.
In fact, the General Assembly asked the JLARC study to be done to look at cost containment and measuring the effectiveness of private schools. And I have not heard of any offer localities any help with more placements. In fact, they're concerned about the number of students who have to go private school or residential as it is statewide. And so the trend is to try to bring students home, least restrictive environment in their community, not out to other placements.
Right, which I can understand. But these children need many, many hands to help, many teachers, many support individuals, because those relationships are human relationships. And that, from when I listened to, by the way, the input from SEPTA was wonderful. And it is those relationships, and we need lots of them. And we need to figure out how we hire enough of them. Well trained. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Strauss. Ms. Palchik, followed by Ms. McLaughlin.
Thank you. I will try not to repeat some of what my colleagues have said, but I do appreciate, unfortunately, the fact that we're here, but the work that is being done. I know your staff is working very quickly to try to answer some of these questions. A couple of things, if we can go back, I think it's a slide before the community engagement. Yes, thank you. And apologize again, we weren't able to look at this or trying to catch up. I think some of the questions about this were asked. A couple of other things I know some community members would find helpful. So when we're talking about the community task force and also the new ombudsman position, I know, for instance, MSAOC is currently preparing a parent handbook, and with this, I believe it's under the ombudsman's office now as well. So I know that is something that's been requested, and when we look at either the role of task force or ACSD, community partners, if we could look into how have a handbook, especially as we develop the policies through the guidelines, and supports around, I know transitions have been an issue from pre-K to elementary to middle, et cetera, all the way up and out of our system. So I know those, I don't think were specifically addressed. I would love to hear more about being able to do that. And also, I think here, definitely, I feel like we're starting to address some of the immediate needs, the audits, the outside audits, and addressing our OCR complaints and reports. I guess in the long term, I just want to make sure that that as we're looking at this, defining the role of the task force, and in my mind is how we can ensure not only that we're fixing what we can from the past, but ensuring it doesn't happen again, right? So what will be, or another area, thank you, but what will be, who are the responsible parties, who will be overseeing this work, what will be the annual and review processes moving forward, and as board members and the future board members, what can we look at to be reported regularly, and so that the board can also be ensured that we are addressing the things like the fidelity of implementation and the training, like our baseline, and what kind of data will we be able to look at to see the progress moving forward. I hope that made sense, because I think we definitely have a concrete plan in place for the immediate effects and the very traumatic experiences that many of our kids have felt, but to be able to have more regular checks as we do in other areas in years to come. But thank you.
Ms. Johnson, would you like to respond to any of that?
A couple. One, the community task force, the conversation about a parent handbook. Thank you. Appreciate that. I know we've had lots of conversation with SEPTA about handbooks. We are currently working on the twice exceptional handbook. We'd finished the dyslexia handbook about 1.5 years ago, and we were working on updating our special ed handbook. So maybe we could include some of those resources and cross-reference some of them. So that's to your first question. The transition question, we have had conversations about what that looks like, and I think Dr. Strong's office is looking at how we can improve those practices with a process. So that is something we're looking at. And as far as the task force, yeah, I would like to engage with the board to have some conversation about task force as opposed to what Mrs. Corbett-Sanders was talking about, and maybe what that could look like. Instead of having multiple groups, could we be more strategic about how we're operating that way? And fidelity of implementation, this continues to be a challenge for us, that we know it's a hurdle. It's not a surprise to them. I talk a lot about doing mini audits instead of these big audits that we know we need to do. So how can we implement mini audits and engage with our region offices in order to do that?
Dr. Ivey.
I would just add that as we build the electronic system and we look at our audits and our methods that we're going to use to measure and monitor both internally amongst our various departments and regions, we also will be discussing and will be working on how will we provide information to the board and the public.
Just to clarify, so some of this, I guess, as we talk about next steps, how we'll be providing information and what kind of task force we're going to be doing, sounds like that's something we'll be looking at our night. Okay, thank you.
Ms. McLaughlin.
Great. I want to first echo what many of my colleagues have said, that Dr. Brabrand, your serious voice to this issue, your compassion and your commitment to looking at this thoroughly and partnering with our community and partnering with this board is very much appreciated. To staff, I know that you've worked very fast, very quickly, not only pulling this information together, but in a comprehensive way, beginning an effort to look at our roadmap. And so today's presentation, while I know it was a rush to time, I know this isn't what normally you want to do, but we did as a board say we wanted to have this work session as fast as possible. So I do think everybody was doing the best they could under a very tight timeline, and this is just the beginning. So I know we'll be going further. I want to echo some things that my colleagues have said, because in the end, this is our work session to work together. So I do think that it is troubling that we only were operating off of guidelines. Guidelines do not ensure standardized best practice. So I am all in favor of, once we've had the full audit, we identify not just policy, but regulations to ensure standardization of practice. I absolutely support a community task force that would also include focus groups. So even those who can't necessarily serve on the community task force, because you need it to be a manageable size group for substantive dialogue, we should have focus groups for all people who want to come and share their family story. I also want to say to SEPTA and FCCPTA in particular, thank you so much for your very engaged communication with this board and with the school division. As a former advocate, I know how important it is to help bring the stories from the front lines directly to the decision makers and say, this is an important issue. We need you to recognize that it's occurring. And I want to thank the brave families who were willing to take their stories as well to be heard. I think that's extremely important. I also wanted to share with all of you that I did go to visit today one of the comprehensive services sites in my district, Laurel Ridge Elementary, where I had a wonderful conversation with a 12-year veteran who is a crisis response teacher. She also showed me the seclusion room, and we stood in it and spent some time talking about how it's implemented. And so I look forward to being part of the dialogue, because I think that in listening to the reports on how they proceed and work with their families, first of all, they absolutely make a phone call that day to a family if the seclusion room has been used. And they also talked about, again, as a last resort, but a way to help meet the needs of students. And since I've run through my 3 minutes, I'll have a go back.
That's what I thought. Thank you. Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank Therese, Ms. Johnson, and all of our staff, and Dr. Brabrand for responding quickly. I know we threw a lot of questions at you. You probably felt like you were in the Matrix or something at some point, but this is just so very important to the community. I'm grateful that I was able to talk along with some of my other colleagues separately with our SPED community, and just really grateful for this opportunity. This is a crisis. I think everyone realizes it's a crisis, but I think that this is an appropriate response. I want to ask a few questions just to make sure that the community feels that we're being as transparent as possible. And so I'll go through all my questions because I know my time is ticking, but I'd like to make sure we talk a little bit about how things are reported now. It sounds as though there is some inconsistency depending on where you are. I have a little bit of concern about the form. I did read through some of the comments we received from SEPTA, and so as a next step, I'd like to make sure that we look at whatever task force that is, that we look at that form, that we determine that that is sufficient information. I also am not quite clear on what oversight is in place right now. And I think the public has some perceptions about what is happening, and I'd like to clear that up as to, even as I know we may need to make some corrections, but we need to know where we are. And we talked a little bit about training, and I'm wondering, even in your presentation, you said that that teachers would be trained, but administrators, hearings officers, all those folks are dealing with the SPED community. So I'm wondering whether they're included, and if not, I'd like for the task force to examine that as a next step. We also mentioned the ombudsman, adding the ombudsmans. Currently, in my conversations with the ombudsmans, it was reported to me that as much as 2/3 of those reports were related to SPED, and that he basically is directing traffic. So my concern is whether the ombudsman is going to be able to have a little bit more substantive conversation, and whether we should consider that in our next step as to how to make that contact with a special education ombudsman more meaningful. Because we have a huge, well, let me not explain it with my 22 seconds. My next steps are, I'd like to make sure that we survey staff members and parents. I'd also like to make sure whether we're making sure in our training that staff is understanding how children feel when they go through restraint. I know that those feelings may vary from child to child. I'd like to consider regular reports to the board with respect to discipline. I'm wrapping it up. Restraint and seclusion in SPED. I don't think we received that specifically. It's not included in those numbers. And the next step is examine the compliance issue and how we're going to have that oversight.
Thank you, Ms. Keys-Gamarra. I presume that means you don't have an immediate need for a go-back?
I'm not sure why you would conclude that.
I'm just teasing. Yes. Ms. Johnson, would you like to respond to this? Or Mr. Bloom?
Sure. So I'll go over a little bit about the reporting procedures as they currently are enforced. So the reporting requirements for schools after an incident of restraint or seclusion involves 3 copies of that documentation form being sent to different places. So 1 copy is sent to the parent or the guardian of the student. 1 copy remains in the student's cumulative folder at the school, and then the 3rd copy goes to the Office of Special Education Instruction. Once the Office of Special Education Instruction receives those forms from individual schools, they are in turn distributed to Tina Wilkerson, who's our coordinator of ABA services, and then Sarah Cooner, who's over in the back there. She's our manager of behavior intervention services, for a thorough review of the incidents that are occurring. From that point, they make determinations, both Tina and Sarah, who to call in to help support the school. So Tina Wilkerson has a team of ABA coaches that support all of our students that are receiving enhanced autism services, preschool autism services, students with autism at our secondary sites, some of our public day sites. Sarah's team supports the behavior intervention teachers. They support our comprehensive services sites, our students that are spending the majority of their time in the general education setting. And Sarah's team also provides support to our preschool special education classrooms. So the ABA coaches and the behavior intervention teachers who are assigned to every school in the county, they will go back to their schools and they will collaborate with the school teams around any interventions, strategies, supports, training that might be needed with that particular student.
Thank you, Mr. Bloom. Mr. Wilson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay.
Mr. Wilson, I'm sorry. Did Ms. Wilson, or I'm sorry, Ms. Johnson want to say something first?
No, I just wanted to follow up briefly. That part of the conversation, the question that you asked, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, was about oversight. And in full transparency, that it hasn't been the form is getting to the people at individual within our department. It's been our systemic oversight of individual schools as a whole, how we track numbers that are coming into school. And that is the process that we need to correct in our department.
Ms. Johnson, I understand there is, I think that's part of the issue, reporting it, but also as I read the comments from parents, I just want to, because it's hard to come back to this. As I read the comments from parents, they're not feeling as though they're getting notified.
Understood.
Or getting sufficient information. So I just wanted to, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Keys-Gamarra. I have that written down as one of my notes, so I appreciate it. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So preliminarily, I have just some questions. You can take these down and answer them at the end. Some of them are just in the nature of clarification, because one of the things you said was that there were no guidelines used prior to 2012, and I don't want to leave the impression for the community that these events happened on an ad hoc basis, depending on what school you were in and what teacher you had, because my guess would be that this isn't a new issue, that there were procedures and practices that were considered best practices in place in Fairfax County. So if you could just respond to that. I also would like to have an answer. I think the community, like me, when they see FCPS reported zeros in multiple years, I'd like to have an update on where the school system is in determining how that happened. If it was an administrative oversight, or do we think there was a code of silence within our system? This is a very important question. The community deserves an answer to that. Okay, stepping away just for a second, within the 203 affected students, do we have data that shows what percentage of these students fell into the autism spectrum and versus other categories of students? And then secondarily, what happens currently when there's a child receiving seclusion and restraint many times? What does Fairfax County do currently in that situation? Since our citizens that spoke at the dais at our last meeting, these were in the hundreds of events, and so I think that we need to try to drill down on that question for the community as well. So, and then lastly, another clarification would be, you mentioned that Fairfax County doesn't have a systematic review, systematic review and improvement process in place. That also I'd like to know just sort of what were we doing then? If we didn't have a systematic process, did we have any process to make sure that we were complying with our best practices?
If I can, let me address one of those questions, Mr. Wilson. The independent review is going to include a full investigation into why we reported zeros in past years. And we will do that investigation. It will be independent, and we will provide the board and the community with those results. And I know that some of the other questions, Ms. Johnson, do you want to respond or have someone on your staff respond to?
I can respond to a few of the questions. So the first question around the guidelines being put into place in 2012 and practices prior to that. So the answer is that for many years, Fairfax County Public Schools has supported our students in behavioral strategies. We've supported our staff through a number of professional development trainings that we've offered. In 2009, we developed behavior intervention services where we hired a number of behavior intervention teachers that supported all of the schools around behavior. Prior to that, central office did have central office staff that supported behaviors and school staff from our adapted curriculum team, our autism team. So yes, for many years we have been providing behavioral professional development, strategies, modeling, hands-on in the classroom, providing support.
Mr. Wilson, are you done?
Well, there were other questions that aren't answered if you want to chime in to fill in some of the other.
So I know that Tina has a process in place with her ABA coaches. You mentioned for students where there are many incidents of either restraint and seclusion in place. So I'll let Tina sort of speak to the process that she and her team go through when there are numerous reports or instances of restraint or seclusion.
So if we're seeing numerous reports, we then go back to the school, and one of the things that the coaches talk to the school about is what strategies are in place. Do we need to develop a functional behavior assessment and a behavior intervention plan? And once that's developed with the families, we then review that every 6 to 8 weeks so that we're always tweaking, we're always looking at that data. And that data, we recommend that they graph it. So the coaches help them learn how to graph it so that we can look at whether or not the behavior is going down.
And I'll add also that there are a number of students who are going through the IEP process where the IEP team might be looking at a more restrictive setting or environment, and that process takes time. Sometimes parents will approve and sign the IEP to have their child attend a more restrictive setting, and other times parents don't sign approval with that process. So sometimes over the course of time, a lot of these discussions are happening within the IEP team, but school teams are still trying to manage the very challenging behaviors of a lot of these students as they work through that process.
And your question about the 203 students and the percentage who are their disabilities identified, that's not currently available on the form. However, with our new electronic process, we will be able to have that information.
Okay, yeah, and that's a very important question. I think a common statistic is 1 in 59 people are affected by autism, which if you apply that to our school system, that's over 3,000 of our students. And so I think that's something that we, I mean, I realize that maybe it's not on the form, but I think if we can do some questioning or, surveying of those teachers who are involved, it would be very good information to get back to the board.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I do have a number of go-backs, but before we have the go-backs, I would like to make a couple of comments. I'm very concerned about the numbers of incidences and then the numbers of incidences per child. And part of this is really accurate record keeping, but more than that, it's the intentionality of serving each child by name and need. And so when I look to my right here, I see a woman who has been a very effective advocate for her child, and I believe his name is Quentin, with 437 incidences. What's a bit disconcerting is that we don't quite understand when an incident may happen multiple times with a child, what is the intervention that the school system has, so that if there is a pattern of incidences that are impacting a single child, what are the actions that are taken? Because, we talk about the partnership between parents and schools. And here it seems like we somehow, on individual cases, not all cases, but in individual cases, that partnership has become fractured because we haven't necessarily made the family aware of the behavioral management techniques that have been used and the impact on that child, and then things escalating. So if somebody could spend a little bit of time on how we actually, in an individual school, if an individual child is having multiple incidences where there's behavior management techniques being put in place, then what is the trigger that says, we need to have a better partnership with the family to address this child's needs? And then secondly, we do have, and that's in the intervention strategies piece, but we also know that we look to provide supports for families to perhaps have external placements, and what conditions are we putting on those families, if at all, for these external placements. So for example, if we offer an external placement, are we saying that we offer it but you're not allowed to talk about it? Because that's, once again, if that's the case, then I'm concerned, because our commitment to transparency and ensuring that we are able to continuously improve and better provide services, we don't know that what we're doing if we are not making sure that those activities are transparent. And then last, going back to this task force concept, the reason I raised the task force concept beyond just this issue is that this issue has brought to light a symptom of the need for better engagement and proactive engagement on the issues impacting our families and our students with special education needs, to ensure that we identify up front what those issues are and begin to work on them as we continue to unpack this issue and others. And so that's what we'll talk a little bit about later on. Does anybody want to talk about the transparency piece and engagement with parents?
Oh, well, I was going to back up a little here. I do want to welcome our principal, Dustin Wright, who's the principal of Old Creek Elementary School, and he does have a comprehensive service site elementary school program, so he certainly can help answer from experience what might happen. But on a broad level, what I'd like to share is, our expectation is that parents are engaged every step of the way. They're engaged in the IEP process as partners, and that we are, when strategies are not working, that we are taking appropriate steps to do a functional behavior plan to identify the behaviors, then create a behavior intervention plan to address those behaviors, keep the documentation, and look at higher level of service as needed. I'm not sure about this. Somebody's saying you're not allowed to talk about it. That should not be occurring in any way. And the multi-agency process is very involved, and Dr. Strong could certainly speak to that process. She's intimately involved at the school level, at the county level as well, and at the state level in the conversation. So if that's some information that you'd like to have about how that process takes place, we can certainly talk about it, because we do advocate. We both sit on the community management policy team and advocate on a regular basis for our students to get appropriate services.
Dustin, do you want to share a little bit as a building principal? I think it would be helpful perspective for the board and the community here this evening.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me here this evening. Again, I'm the principal at Old Creek Elementary School, which is a small community school in the Woodson Pyramid. In addition to our the population that attends from our boundaries, we're the site of a comprehensive service site and an enhanced autism program at Old Creek. I think some of the things that that you're hearing about it being a partnership with the family are things that we aspire to at our school, and making sure that we're working together and that there's high levels of communication and transparency. Some of the things I'll speak to the comprehensive service site at Oak Creek. 4 things that that really we try and define it is it has a lower staff to student ratio. It has higher levels of behavioral support. It has higher levels of clinical support, and it has a tremendous amount of structure for our students. All of those things allow us to provide lots of communication with our families. That communication happens on a daily basis through written information that goes home, and then it allows us, because of the staff and the approach that we use, to really develop relationships with the families that support our students, because we're looking for that consistency between school and home to be able to support them and give them the resources that they need. I would say some of the things that have been discussed, that when we see an increase in incidences, or we just see any type of concern related to the student, that immediately triggers a higher level of communication with our families. If we're seeing, whether it's a behavioral thing or an academic indicator, or something related to the any of the social and emotional things that we're working on with our students. Anytime we see that change, anytime we see some of the data that we're collecting give us the indication that we need to come together again as that school to home team, those are the steps that we take. I would say our staff also communicates frequently. I told you those 4 things about the CSS program. The thing that I think makes it really strong is the staff is constantly communicating amongst themselves about the students and how to support them. On a minimum of a weekly basis, our case managers go together and work with the clinical team and the admin team to talk about how each student is doing. So we have that frequent ability to talk about the students and where they are. So we put all those things together and really try and use that as an opportunity to have a really solid communication with our families and to really understand where the students are coming from and how to best support them each day. Thank you.
Ms. Johnson, do you want to add to it? Just to be clear, what I was indicating about having families not speak about it, it's the non-disclosure agreements associated with some of our families getting private placement that's been raised by a number of people in the community, and I was wondering if anybody could address when we have NDAs and why.
I'm not clear what you're talking about, so maybe we could, I'm not sure, I'm sorry.
I'll just have as a follow-up question if we could have a explanation of when we have NDAs with parents regarding private placement or other services offered to students with disabilities, and to what extent there are that many of them.
Can I just caution, I don't want us to wander into areas that are closed session. So I want to be very careful about this.
I'm not taking it into specific individual situations. I just would like to better understand when we do it. And so if that needs to go into closed session, I will ask Mr. Foster to provide us an update on that. Thank you. So I do have a number of go-backs. Ms. Schultz, followed by Ms. Evans, Ms. McLaughlin, and Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Okay, I have a number of questions. What is the timeline for submitting the federal corrected numbers?
I'm going to ask Mary Beth Lefglass to hop in here. She has an answer. I don't think there's any specific timeline.
First of all, I wasn't here when we did the 3-minute rule. I don't like how 3 minutes, but then if we ask a question, then it goes. I don't know how this got developed. I don't think it's workable. So now I have to barrage with a whole series of questions and then
Ms. Schultz, I've stopped the clock so that the answer can happen, and then you can pick up again.
Okay.
We anticipate the corrections in the fall.
Okay, that's non-specific. The question about whether information is being collected on the form, whether the student has an IEP, I can't imagine a student who is subjected to seclusion and restraint who doesn't have an IEP. Maybe it happens, I don't know. But the whole issue of what's collected on the form is the very reason I said, before we go and start collecting data, we have to talk to the people who are involved in this in order to figure out what we have to fix. Like, how do you improve it? Well, until you talk to, and with all due deference to SEPTA, I'm very grateful for I went and read the survey that they did today. It was phenomenal. We also have a state-mandated ACSD. So there are groups that are working in the community that we should consult before we go collect data. So that's that point. You said earlier that it should only be used in dangerous situations. Could you define dangerous and what has been communicated now to schools? What went out? What was the communication out, and what's a dangerous situation?
So dangerous is if there's a safety concern for the student, because we do have some self-injurious behavior with some of our kids, or if there's continuous aggression. At that point, if it becomes a safety issue to others, then that might be when seclusion or restraint is used.
And I'll add that in our staff training, as well as in our current guidelines document, we do state that issues of disrespect, property damage, noncompliance are not reasons and do not warrant the use of physical restraint and/or seclusion. It's only in those extreme emergency situations when there's risk of injury to that student, other students, or staff that it would be warranted for use. And a lot of it is a judgment call too, because you could have a kindergarten student who is kicking other students, but it might not reach an emergency level where there's risk of harm or injury. You could have a high school student who is repeatedly kicking another student in the head who's fallen on the ground where it might reach an emergency situation. So a lot of judgment comes into play when staff are making decisions around when to use either restraint and or seclusion.
Okay, so everything you just said, when we go back to, can we please go back to slide 11, which is the disaggregate, or the number slide? The entire reason we must, and I beseech constantly, 7 years I've been doing it on data, data has to have context. There are, I think I recall 7 public day schools and 16 comprehensive service sites. If on the numbers, if the 1,000, whatever it is, 679, if 90% of those have occurred at 3 sites, that means we have a very limited problem. If they're evenly distributed across the CSS sites but not occurring in the public day schools, that's a different problem. We haven't quantified the problem. If we don't, you cannot measure or manage what you don't measure. And we're not measuring it because we're not quantifying the data within context. Is it happening predominantly with elementary students, with middle school students, with high school students, in certain areas with certain principals? That means we may have pockets of excellence, like our principal speaker here tonight, where we draw off of that as a gold standard, but we don't know because we haven't quantified. Are the 1,679, are 85% of that with 10% of the students? It's a different set of the problems. So I ask not only for the disaggregation for this, but the same disaggregation we've been asking for the discipline data. It's exactly the same. You cannot understand the disproportionality to boys of color, to boys of color who are students with disabilities if we don't understand how the data breaks down. So I'm going to do that. I'm sorry. I'm going to
have it go back again, Ms. Schultz.
No.
Yes.
No, hold on. Guidelines, I'm going to echo. I started it. I'm saying guidelines are not policy, and policy has, only with policy do we get accountability to this board. So we have to ask for a report on this. Have to ask for the report. And we must develop as a board a policy associated with this.
We have that as a follow-on, so I think we all agree to that.
And I'm reserving my second go back. I'm reserving the space. I may not use it, but I'll decide.
Thank you very much, Ms. Schultz. Okay, so we have Ms. Evans followed by Ms. McLaughlin.
Thank you. I did want to start by correcting something that I'd said before. The special needs category is the highest category for the ombudsman. It's not a majority, though. I just went back and looked at the quarterly reports. It's clearly by far the highest category. It constitutes about a quarter of the cases that he receives. So just wanted to correct that. My question now goes to situations where, as alternatives to restraint and seclusion, if we're dealing with a dangerous situation, a potentially dangerous situation, Mr. Bloom, you and I have talked about situations where the other students are removed from the classroom. Do we keep track of those situations? And I'm asking anybody. I know you and I had that conversation. So,
Evans, are you asking when the room is cleared and the child is left in the room? Yes. Do we have a number of those incidences?
Right. I would like to get a sense of how often that strategy is used, and perhaps this is for Ms. Johnson to answer. If how we keep track of those instances.
So, if a room clear results in a seclusion of a student, so if the room is cleared and if a staff is in that room and preventing that student from leaving, that would, under our definition of seclusion, be considered an instance of seclusion.
Oh,
then
that would be in those.
then that
in
would
those
be in those, that's right, the reporting forms.
where all the other students are removed from the classroom.
If that student is prevented from leaving that room.
Oh, all right.
Sometimes there's a room clear and the student hasn't quite reached what we call peak, where their behaviors are so out of control that they're a danger to themselves or others.
Yes.
So in that instance, if a student is alone in a room with a staff, not prevented from leaving, but they're just de-escalating and cooling down, we would not consider that to be a seclusion of a student. Because again, under our definition, it's when it's reached an emergency situation when there's risk of injury to another student or someone else, and they're left alone in a room.
Okay. So I guess, I'm sorry, I'm still a little unclear here. Sometimes that situation where there's a room clear, sometimes that's considered seclusion and sometimes it's not?
That's correct.
Okay. Is there a way for us to get a read on how often we do use the room clear strategy, whether it's considered seclusion or not considered seclusion?
Well, currently we don't collect that data, only the times where it reaches a seclusion situation. Okay. But we don't collect data centrally on room clears in general.
Okay. Would you think that most times that happens, it's considered seclusion or not, just based on your knowledge?
I would say based on my knowledge, I would say not.
Not
considered seclusion. That's correct.
Okay. I guess I would be interested to know how often we use this strategy. Do you consider it a successful strategy as an alternative to restraint and seclusion when it's not considered seclusion?
I would consider it a successful strategy. I know that there are students that we want to maintain their level of dignity and respect, and it's easier to remove the other students from that particular environment at a time when a student's escalating than to risk trying to remove that student from the classroom. And very often, what may happen is you will see the escalation of behaviors continue to escalate outside the classroom, down the hallway, to the main office, where other students might be able to observe what's happening. So in some cases, in some instances, it's better to keep the student contained within the classroom and then quickly remove the other students. And many schools and teachers have a plan in place for when they need to implement a room clear. So there's a process or a procedure in place where the students will go. They might have activities that are already put in place in another teacher's classroom so that when they go into another classroom, they're able to continue with the instruction very seamlessly.
Okay. I guess if we don't collect data, we don't collect data. If there's any way to try to quantify that strategy, I would appreciate it.
And I'll add, too, that sometimes, again, to maintain the dignity and respect of all of our students, some of the behaviors can reach a level where we would rather do a room clear. We have students that will take off their clothing within the classroom. We have many students that can engage in very serious self-injurious behaviors. So again, maintaining student dignity and respect is an important piece. And so again, a lot of judgment goes into play from our teachers, whether or not to do a room clear or to try to remove that student from the classroom environment. So if we feel that there's an emergency situation where a student in the classroom has access to items that might be dangerous or a danger to themselves or others, we want to remove that student from any sort of reinforcing items or remove that student from any potential things that could be harmful. We've had instances where students have climbed on top of file cabinets, and there's always a risk of injury with file cabinets and bookshelves tipping over. We've had students that have picked up computers and laptops and have thrown them across the room. At windows, we're concerned with a lot of the windows in classrooms of glass breaking and the potential hazard that that might cause to that student or other students. So again, depending on the behaviors that are being exhibited, staff make judgment decisions on whether it's better to keep the student in that classroom or remove them.
Ms. McLaughlin?
The reason I wanted to go back is because something that I had shared with my colleagues is that just last week I had the opportunity to meet with a nationally recognized education advocate out of Chicago. It's called the Educational Advocacy and Consulting Group. They also have an office here in Ashburn, Virginia. They also work with COPA, which is the Council of Parents, Attorneys, and Advocates, which is based in Towson, Maryland. And so those are two organizations that I understand certainly would welcome the opportunity to collaborate with Fairfax County Schools and our advocates and partners. I also wanted to have a question to staff, but I'm going to hold on to it to the end, just so I make sure I get through the rest of this stuff. I also want to ask that as a next step, that part of this audit and consideration for best practices, that we look at consulting with Inova Hospital, because hospitals have very clear, strict guidelines on seclusion and restraint. And so I think that's another area which we need to learn from them. To some of the questions my colleagues have raised since my most recent turn, the ombudsman issue, Ms. Evans, thank you for doing the calculations on special education cases that have come through there. I would just say as a next step, Dr. Brabrand, we're going to need to have a discussion with the board because so many of us have asked for an ombudsman for years and years, and we're thrilled that you've done it, but I feel like this is something that the board needs to partner with you on. So hopefully 13 good minds will get us where we need to go. But there needs to be a clarity of role and purpose. I adore our ombudsman, Armando Perry, but he's got to be provided with the best supports and processes and avenues available. So when families come to an ombudsman, it might be because they haven't been able to work it out with school-based staff or even at central offices. They've gone to the ombudsman. Then what? Is it that he comes to the RAS, the regional area superintendents, DSS, to you, the board? I think we're going to need to kind of have a little rubric there. I also, I guess, as I'm running out of time again, here's my question to staff. There is the House Bill 7124 that Congressman Don Beyer has sponsored. He's got over 40 co-sponsors, including Congressman Jerry Conley as well. I would just like to get staff's opinion on that House bill, because that's not come to the board, and I'm supposed to be the federal liaison. So I think this is something that apparently he just filed in November 2018, but the timing of this is such that I'd like to understand more.
I can give you a little bit of information about that in researching all of what Virginia is doing as it compares to Don Beyer's bill and others. The bill is slightly different than what Virginia's new proposed regulation has in it. His bill, I believe, excludes seclusion altogether. And so, but I have not heard, there's nowhere that I've seen it posted what the timeline is on action for that bill going through the rest of the process. When we find that out, we can certainly report it out.
So, Ms. McLaughlin, are you advocating that as a next step that we have amend our legislative package to address how we want to impact that legislation?
I do think it's a next step. And by the way, it's called the Keep All Students Safe Act, CASA. But I do think that the board's going to need a briefing, not just on the CASA bill, but also on what's going on in Virginia. Again, the third largest school division in the Commonwealth. Where's our voice been on it? Zero, because the board didn't know about it.
Thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. Ms. Keys-Gamarra?
Thank you. I just want to go back, and I know that the behavior intervention teachers are in there for 5, which that request was made prior to knowing about this problem. And so I have some concerns about 5 for the entire county and dealing with this issue, whether that is even feasible or not. You forgot to push my time. I want to be respectful. So I'd like to speak, someone to speak to that, because that was already on the books. We have 17 in the county, which is already inadequate. So I'd like to hear, you know, what we need to do. The board needs to hear about that. I do also have some concern about how we are monitoring implementation of what's being recommended. I hear reports, good and bad, on behavior intervention teachers, and some of them may have to, they could simply be overwhelmed. We have 3 people covering the county. I can't imagine 17 actually trying to go and do more than listen and teach and then monitor. So I think the board needs to receive a realistic report on what is necessary, and then how do we make sure that we are implementing these policies and our regulations as they are now. And we do need the update, and I think a number of people have said we need to write a policy. But I'm just not understanding how we could possibly monitor this efficiently. You also gave some numbers with respect to seclusion. Do these numbers on page 11 refer to Gen Ed as well? Because I know in your initial comments, you stated that this could happen in Gen Ed, but it wasn't clear to me whether the reporting that was the numbers that we had, I believe, that were on page 11 included that. I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to say it again, we're talking about behaviors, but we're also talking about children that have a particular neurological makeup in many instances, and their actions are lined up with their neurological makeup. And so I'm wondering if the perspective that we are taking and seeing it as behaviors, as in a negative connotation, rather than understanding who they are as a person. There has been some concern from the community regarding inappropriate placements. I understand there are ASD and ED programs, etc. And how do we deal with such those circumstances? I didn't use all my time. I don't know.
Yes, I'd like to respond. We would welcome more behavior intervention teachers and ABA coaches. 5, we had originally talked about 5, 1 per region. I was trying not to overreach. We would like to have some conversation about maybe not necessarily regionally, but where our needs are. Our behavior intervention teachers and our ABA coaches who are supervised by Tina are overwhelmed, and they do have anywhere from 9 to 14 schools each. My vision for the future would be more at minimum 1 per pyramid, but that was wishful thinking, Ms. Keys-Gamarra. So I would welcome any conversation, and I know both of our ladies here, if there are reports of a particular behavior intervention teacher that may not be effective. So I welcome that. Gen Ed numbers are included? Yes.
Second, that with respect to the behavior intervention teachers and what's needed, I think that may be a next step.
Thank you.
That discussion.
The general ed students are included in these restraint and this 203 number and in the over 1,600 numbers. They are a small number. And behaviors having a negative connotation, I think everybody at this table, you're talking to special educators. So I know, and Tina works very closely with our low incidence population and can speak to behaviors speak. They represent thoughts, frustrations, emotions, and so you are talking to educators. Does every educator feel that way? That's our job, to educate the other educators in the system.
Right, and I'm just going to use a little grace here, if I may. That's my concern, right? Because how you label the child determines how you deal with the child, and so I want to make sure we get to that issue.
Thank you, Ms. Keys-Gamarra. I now have Mr. Wilson for a go back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the one point I think overriding that I want to make is, and I think this ties into what Dr. Braybrand brought up at the beginning, which is the caring culture that we have as sort of a critical structure, a critical piece of how we educate our children. And I guess the one thing that, in responding to some of the questions about how do we as a system respond to situations involving students and contacting parents, in my experience with parents coming to me, they do not experience what you've described. That's not how they describe it to me when they come to my office hours. It's quite different, actually. And I just was looking at the how do we improve, and it's data collection, community engagement, trainings. Not a lot in there about parents. There's the ombudsman, but really it's about at that point of contact with the families who are in a stage of distress in any event because they have a child with an IEP, as I do, and helping those parents, engaging them, being with them in that journey so that they feel cared for. And that's really something that I think you need to think about in this improvement plan.
Can I address that?
Please do.
I think you've raised an excellent point, and I think that that is something that we will need to, as we engage with more parents and more stakeholder groups, we will want to strongly consider that as a part of our training. And so we say that we're going, and we know that we are going to look at all aspects of training, and that really what you're describing, Mr. Wilson, is what needs to happen at the classroom level and with teachers and with the school level with administrators. And we need to engage and make sure, you know, that is happening.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Ivey, for responding. I mean, unfortunately, when we have a conversation around the table with extremely knowledgeable educators in a very large system, I think that Ms. Hines mentioned voices. It can become a little antiseptic, this conversation, but there's really a lot of intensity at that level that we need to recognize in how we think about, you know, what can we do to our system. And Dr. Braybrand, I just want to go back to the 0 reports that were submitted by our system. That's reflective of an uncaring culture, right? Putting up zeros. And I know that we're going to bring in an auditor and we're going to look at it, but, you know, I just think that we've got to be able to be responsive right now about those sorts of issues too.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Ms. Hines?
Yeah, thank you. Just a few reflections as I was listening to everyone. One thing, as a teacher, the most powerful thing I have learned is that this statement that behavior is communication. And it's just something once you understand that, then you are much better equipped right away to deal with behavior, any behavior. And also, I will say, my experience out in Loudoun County as an aide in the self-contained K-2 autism classroom, and thank you for the report from our principal here, that teacher actually wrote a full page of communication to every parent every day. And I don't know if that's typical, but that was our understanding of what you had to do. And there was data on there, like what the child ate and how many times the child went to the bathroom. I mean, it was all kinds of data and specific commentary about that child, and it was very personal. The communication in that setting between school and home seemed extremely intense, actually. And I assume that's not happening everywhere, but it seemed to be a best practice. I just want to say, too, we keep talking about an emergency situation. And when we were talking before about when you clear a room, what is that called and what does it mean? And I think we all are understanding, and maybe we just need to say it out loud, that this is a situation where, you know, an ounce of prevention is, worth a pound of better practice, right? And so I finally, in my job in Loudoun County, I did get the MANT training. And maybe if we could talk a little bit about what that is, because you do learn how to safely hold a child in that training, but before you even learn that, you learn how to de-escalate, how to prevent, how to help a child who's not communicative communicate, so that the emergency situation doesn't happen in the first place. And I think to the extent that we could give that MANT training to everybody, at least maybe people who work in lower elementary, because I think that's where we sometimes have new kids to the system who we don't know, and they come in with behaviors that our gen ed teachers are just not equipped to deal with. I've been in that situation too.
So I can tell you a little bit about our MANT training. And Tina can talk a little bit to our other training that we do, certification training called Professional Crisis Management, or PCM. So the MANT training is a certification training. It's a 2-day training, and the first day of training is called the relational training, or the relational certification. So under the relational components, there are, as you mentioned, training around prevention, around de-escalation. It's around relationship building. It's around interpersonal communication skills that teachers have with students. And it also centers around conflict resolution. So what are all of those preventative techniques that teachers can employ during the crisis cycle when kids have not quite reached peak, where their behaviors are out of control, so that with the ultimate goal of de-escalating those students and bringing them back down to calm. So that's day one. And when they move into day two, it's really all about safety. Day two is about the physical interaction techniques that will keep that student and others in that room safe if there's a need to physically intervene. And again, those are for students who have now reached peak, where their behaviors are out of control, that there is a risk of injury or harm to that child or others. So some of the techniques involved with the MANT system could be assisting and supporting skills. They could be separating skills. So there are some skills where if a teacher is having their hair pulled, is one example, and the student has a grasp of their hair, what's the safest way possible to release that hold so that teacher or another student and that child is safe? What are the appropriate or safest ways to approach a student that might be coming at a teacher or another student with a pair of scissors, let's say, or some other weapon? So again, the physical interaction techniques, again, are done for the purpose of keeping people safe and learning the best practice techniques in order to be able to do that. So I'll let Tina talk a little bit about the PCM training.
So PCM was actually developed by a board-certified behavior analyst. So there's a lot of the ABA strategies. Right from the beginning, we start talking about the same types of things, that prevention. What do we do in stable functioning? What is that teaching that we need to teach our kids for replacement behaviors and looking at adaptive behaviors, the things they can do, and how can we increase those things? And then it also goes into how to de-escalate kids who are starting to become escalated, and then into how to get them finally through the crisis cycle. Along with many of the same things that Mike talked about, there are also ways just to separate kids with just a simple physical turn that don't include much physical support at all. So all those pieces with us are practiced over and over. Every teacher has to have those same physical movements done on them from other teachers so that they feel what that feels like, so that they understand that kid perspective. There's a fading process which we needed with our children because of not having that language piece. That was part of that. And so we continue to go in and to really hone those preventative types of strategies all the time with our teachers.
One of the things that the MANT system has allowed us to do is to take the relational portion of their training and use that information to create our own modified training. So it's a 3-hour training of the relational piece. So staff members aren't certified in the relational components of MANT, but what we've been able to do is we've been able to train all of our bus drivers and attendants on the relational pieces of MANT so that They know how to build healthy relationships. They know about the concepts of de-escalation and prevention, crisis prevention. And we've also provided central trainings where, again, we focus on that relational piece, the interpersonal communication skills, de-escalation. So that's been an added benefit to working with the MANT system as well.
Also, this year, we continue our training with our bus drivers to include specific situations and helping them be more able to get kids in and out of the bus in a more appropriate way. So that's been a huge, where they felt really comfortable with being able to ask some of those questions too. So we start that now, and that'll be for 2 months. We'll be doing training.
Thank you, Ms. Hines. Is that all? Ms. Strauss, followed by Ms. Palchik.
Thank you very much for describing the MANT and the other training. That was one of the questions that I had. Are some of these de-escalation techniques available for parents to learn? I know ABA training, and that's very much a partnership. But parents are struggling and love their children, are trying to figure this out at home. But how much is this available for parents as well as partners in the MANT training, for example?
So this question has come up a number of years ago, and we actually went to our Office of Risk Management to talk with them about whether or not we could train parents in the physical interaction techniques, and it was recommended at that time that that we should not train parents. Part of the requirements of getting trained in MANT, there are a lot of requirements that staff need to agree to. So, for example, if you're a staff member and you're pregnant beyond a certain time, you shouldn't take the MANT training because of the potential risk or injury that it could have to you. Physical interaction techniques involve bending over, getting on the ground. So there are a lot of medical implications. So if you're a staff member that has chronic back problems, and if you're under the care of a physician, then the MANT system would not recommend that you take the physical interaction techniques. So for that reason, at least in the past when we've explored that, we haven't allowed parents to take the full MANT training.
I would hope that as we work with ACSD, with SEPTA, and with our parents, that we look at how we collaborate with the latest best practice, research, whatever, in de-escalation, because that child lives at home with the family as well as living at school. And I think the closer the partnership and the better the techniques, everyone is going to feel much more successful, and we hope that we see growth in the child's learning opportunities. My other question is, I know that when we adopted ABA, we hoped that that would be a silver bullet and help so many more children gain communication and language skills. And of course, it doesn't. It is very helpful, and it's not a silver bullet. Unfortunately, there are a lot of silver bullets in life. The other question that I have is, I know that we have, I guess, between 3,000 to 4,000 children on autism spectrum now, and in this chart, we're looking at 203 children with the most challenging behaviors. Are we seeing a growth in that number? And our CSS sites and our day programs, are we seeing more children with greater challenges? Have these programs grown over time? And I know years and years ago, these children were never in their base school, and we've tried to bring kids home. And we have fewer children in outside placements. We wanted to bring them home and care for them ourselves. But my question is, are we seeing more children with greater needs? And I know in talking with teachers and their tremendous desire for help and support, and sometimes physical problems, and how do we help the children? What are the kind of resources that we need? But are we seeing more children with these kinds of needs?
I have the number in my file here somewhere, but since 2010, the number of students with autism certainly has increased from somewhere, and this is a rough number, 2,300 in 2010 to about over 4,000 in 2019. So, and that's for many reasons, identification, better identification. So definitely our numbers are increasing. I think it would be hard for us to say that our numbers in our public day programs and our CSS programs are growing, because we have shifted to really trying to serve our students in their neighborhood school as much as possible. And we have changed those programs over the course of the years that I've been in Fairfax County. They were ED centers, and then they became the CSS programs, then they became ED comprehensive services sites, and then shifting to the comprehensive services sites to meet the needs of a larger population of students with special needs. So it would be hard for us to determine, but maybe we could discuss some way we could look at how our students, are we seeing students with higher needs? Anecdotally, we will tell you at the elementary, definitely. So we could probably put our heads together and come up with something.
Yes, that was actually the report that we got back from you last year, that our teachers were seeing concerns among our younger students and asking for help.
Thank you, Ms. Strauss. I now have Ms. Palchuk.
Thank you. And I appreciate my two past colleagues brought up teachers and parents. And my question, I appreciate Principal Wright being here, is looking at this as well and more on the administrative principal level, especially as we're bringing more and more students, right, to base schools, working on inclusion. Keep in mind we have more students in our general ed classrooms, and also the fact that hiring in special ed, we know, is the biggest challenge, right? So, and I've, having met with so many of my principals, realized some have had the training, understanding, and really know what to look for going into classrooms, how to set up classrooms, how to do trainings, ensure their gen ed staff, even their substitutes, have more exposure to how to support special ed students. So I guess the question and what I would love to understand as a follow-up is, I guess from our coaches, administrators, at the school level, all the way up to the regions, what are best practices and how do we get more of what the special ed, trained staff, and I know having worked at a camp that had trained staff, how much I learned from them and how to support students beyond, the MANT training, what to look for, how to communicate with parents, and how our staff overseeing and supporting teachers, especially if we're only going to have 5 more, right, countywide. We really need to ensure this is both supported, trained, and evaluated at the school, the classroom level. So I guess that conversation of how we really bring this back into everything else we do, caring culture and student achievement-wise.
So I'm going to try to answer your question. I will say with the redevelopment of our Great Beginnings program, our new teacher program, I'm staring at Sarah Cooner back there because she developed, along with Mike and our team, the modules for the classroom management, and much of that was based off the relational pieces of MANT. So Sarah, do you want to address a little bit about that aspect of Great Beginnings?
Right. Thank you for allowing me to speak this evening and be here with you. I am the program manager for Behavior Intervention Services, and we currently have 17 behavior intervention teachers. And I know it seems very daunting, but we work very collaboratively within the structures that we have with multi-tiered systems of support. And as we're addressing more complex behavioral challenges, we're looking at it as a collaborative process. It can't be just singular, and we cannot afford to work in silos. We have to work collaboratively. So maybe even on one case, we may be working, our goal is to build capacity within every classroom, with every school building. So the opportunities for us to come into those buildings and support maybe a singular case, it opens up that opportunity for more expansive staff development. I mean, we're doing staff development training for bus drivers, for special ed staff, for general ed staff, in order to keep the environment safe and using preventative and intervention strategies and support. So we're working with curriculum intervention teams, with psychological services, with social work services, so that it's a continual collaborative process. We're also providing more expansive trainings, even with social work services, with counseling services, so to promote more of a understanding when we're talking about students with high functioning autism, when we're talking about students with twice exceptionalities. So it is very much a collaborative process and ongoing. We are developing training plans with schools, not just at a district level, but we're always trying to get back at school base, because it's a matter of what's happening within those buildings and then conveying to those individual classrooms. So I think that, again, we want to have that. 5 doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a lot when we look at the expanse of what we're able to do right now. We've been able to do 22,000 consultations, last year alone. And I have a team of folks that do come with a applied behavior analysis background. So we're also data-driven in our decision-making process. So it's not just I agree with you, we need to be able to measure what that progress is, and then look at the extensive needs that we have. Our preschoolers coming to us, we're seeing a lot of change in our demographics and dynamics of what we need to do to change to meet the more expansive needs. So that's where I want to make sure that we are research-based in what we're doing. We're collaborating with Children's National to expand what we're doing with students on the high-functioning autism, what we're doing to be using more curriculum intervention supports.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate that.
So I guess I appreciate that. My bigger overarching question is really about data on principals and administrators, what trainings they've received, how we know that a principal understands the best practices and is implementing them in their own building. And they're the number one person, right, who should be able to go into a classroom and know what's being done, how it's being done, is it supporting all of the students, and are they trained in behavior interventions, are new principals as well as existing principals, right? They're our first line of support and evaluation and communication with teachers, with parents. And I think the more we close those silos, right, the more we'll be able to get to that integrity of implementation, to that every classroom, every student, every school, every pyramid. So I guess that's my question, and maybe it's the types of questions we need to ask to get that information as you develop that. What have principals received in training? What is done at every school? Because I'm honestly tired of hearing, oh, if you have a student with these needs, these are the 3 schools that get it. Every school should get it, right? How do we get every school, every principal to get it, and what do we need to get there? This is my big question.
I want to make one comment about that, Ms. Palchik. I think this is an opportunity to look at, just candidly, Fairfax has been about support structures, not necessarily accountability structures. That's the bottom line. So we need to use this opportunity to relook, yes, and we need to continue to have structures in place for support. Support the teachers, support the administrators. But then we also need to have the opportunity to have structures in place for accountability. There are a lot of places in Fairfax County Public Schools, I believe, where best practices are happening with staff who are caring and are trained. But when it's not going well, and we're talking about this level of impact, this is why we've gotten to this point. So it's building the support structures and making sure we're good there, and we're going to take a look at that. What do we truly need? And we've had 10 years of budget cuts. I think special education with maintenance of effort I'm not the budget expert to know exactly how that's played out in the special ed world, but I know everything else in Fairfax since coming back. 10 years of not moving forward, and all of that support for additional behavior, frankly, came from Dr. Domenech back in the 90s. I mean, that's 15 years ago before we had those kind of investments going on. But the accountability structures will be a part of the review that we're going to do.
And
Dr. Ivey?
I would just like to add, in addition, we are really taking a deeper dive and reviewing the leadership development training for our principals, both our new principals as well as our existing and experienced principals. And I think this is an area in which we can make sure that we have a more comprehensive training as a part, and it's something that every principal will receive.
So I'd like to hear, right, the plan. I assume it won't be ready tomorrow, but for existing and new principals, the training and then the accountability for their schools.
Thank you, Ms. Palchik. I have a number of go-backs again, but before we go to those go-backs, I want to take my turn. So I'll turn on the start. I'm a bit concerned that we are looking at how we react to behaviors. And this is a reactionary model, which is that when behaviors are exemplified, then we react with interventions that include restraint and seclusion. I would love to hear a bit more about how we can be more proactive in ensuring that we address the needs up front of our children that are trying to communicate with us, and when they get frustrated, they react in a certain manner, and then we have a counter reaction. And so it would be very helpful if we can talk a bit about how we train our staff, or if we're not doing enough training of our staff in how to prevent these behaviors, how to meet those children where they're at and provide supports to help them communicate in other ways. And so that would be my first question. The second question, we've talking a lot about training tonight. I'd like to have a deeper dive on who is trained, how they're trained. Is it online or is it in person? How often they're trained, how training is refreshed, and really looking at this is how we meet these individual children where they're at, because each one of them, they're a parent's child, but they're our children.
So I'm going to answer as much of that as I can and encourage my team to step in. We certainly don't want to have a reactionary approach to any of the behaviors. I've already shared with you in the second discipline, phase 2 of our discipline study, that we're in the midst of revamping multi-tiered systems of support and rolling it out, taking the whole child approach to academics, behavior, and wellness. So we are moving into our all-county principals meeting this week, where we will be working with principals again to initiate, for those who have not developed a framework for their building, the expectation is that they begin to look at the whole child and develop a framework and have that in place. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds with MTSS, but Tier 1, good, strong Tier 1 instruction is a priority, and that would be having a strong positive behavior intervention approach and making sure that we're addressing behaviors for all students across the building, and then looking at what Tier 2 supports we're putting in place for students. Do they need social skills group? What needs to be retaught? And so on. And we do have, in the appendix, there is some information about our training. One, there are a couple slides, 3 slides actually. One gives a very brief list of some trainings that we offer that are optional. And there are 2 slides in there that address the training that is for all county. And I agree with you. I think we've gone a little too far down as a system into the online module. But we are challenged with, back to what Mr. Moon said earlier, budgetary constraints and how we serve and train a very large number of people. So that is something that we do need to consider and have some conversation about together.
So for our program specifically, we offer communication training at every opportunity that we have for training. Additionally, the coaches are embedded into the classroom at least once a week, so they actually do some hands-on training with staff there. We also offer that because we do monthly parent trainings that include both the behavioral piece, but also the communication piece, the social skills, how to implement that in the home setting. So we continue to offer as much training on that, and then also going into that classroom so we can do hands-on with them in the classroom.
If I could just say, and I think we're doing it, but I just want to pause and take a moment. You're giving us pieces that are going to help inform the next steps that we're going to get to shortly whenever. Yeah, I mean, what's ever next that helps us. Remember, we have gone from having this happen to being with you in, I don't know, 10 days, 14 days. So we're not so far along that part of the next steps can guide some of the work we're about to do. And I just want to say that to you up front. So that's the big benefit of right now, right here, is when we get to the next steps that some of this can be shaped. And we know training is a huge piece of it. How to do it at scale, how to do it well, how to be accountable of someone, or we go and find that a school hasn't had that teacher that's had the training. How do we induct new teachers? How do we induct teachers who come in the middle of the year? Those are the things that I think are going to make up some of the next steps based on the things I'm hearing right now.
Oh, we have a list of next steps. I'm sure that Ms. Medea is doing that for us as we speak. Thank you, Dr. Brabrand. I do have Mr. McElveen, followed by Ms. McLaughlin, Ms. Schultz, and Ms. Keys-Gamarra will have the last word.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Going back to what Ms. McLaughlin raised, I do want to take that a step further and ask if staff has given any thought to what our county is going to do if HB 7124 passes, which again is the CASA Act. What is our next step if we do have to look beyond seclusion and restraint? Do we have any answer for that tonight?
No. We do
Okay.
not have an answer yet. That is something we're going to have to
Then
consider.
that's a next step. I think we need to figure out what's next. So and then the numbers that we've seen before us tonight. My question is the 1679 that's up there. That is what has been reported to central office to Tina on the forms, correct?
Correct.
Do we have any sense of what the a rate of underreporting might be? You know, how, I don't know if there's any way to measure that or have a sense if this is close to the actual number or what we might not be getting.
I think once we start digging into the data from past years and this year, I hope to have a better understanding of that. It is a concern of mine as well. And we will, at the all-county principals meeting, be doing retraining for all administrators on April 4th. About restraint and seclusion, and I will be talking to them about the importance of data collecting and following our current guidelines. So I'm hoping, Ryan, it is a concern of mine, and I want to ensure that we have all of the data.
Okay, great. And my last point would be, we were talking a lot about MANT training. You know, I've heard cases where that process has not been followed as prescribed, and I'm wondering, and I want to ensure that as a system we are teaching the full MANT procedure that includes de-escalation and does not skip over that. Can you ensure us that that is the case?
Yes. So individuals who are certified in the physical interaction techniques of MANT first go through that day one of relational training. So both components are required. So staff are not certified to engage in the physical interaction techniques unless they've completed the relational pieces.
Okay.
And there are a series of tests that go along with the training that they need to also pass. And there's also annual recertification for all staff who are trained in either relational or what we call the technical aspects of MANT training.
Okay, great. Well, I would just suggest, because of things that I've heard anecdotally, that we double down on that and make sure the full process is being followed. Thank you.
Ms. McLaughlin?
I wanted to pick up a little bit on something I mentioned earlier in my visit to the Laurel Ridge CSS site. As I mentioned, that the teacher who runs what they call their support room, the crisis response teacher, she noted that they had less than 30 incidences of some form of seclusion over the last year. Again, their protocol is to make a phone call and communicate with the parents that day if it's happened. It's my understanding that the Laurel Ridge CSS site has a very good reputation and rapport with the families because, again, the seclusion isn't used as a means of punishment, but to meet the individual needs of the students where there are concerns. So when I looked at what these national advocacy groups are talking about, it is the concern where there is unnecessary seclusion and restraint, where you can cause cognitive, social, and emotional developmental harm to students. And so segueing then into the CASA Act that, again, is being sponsored not just by Congressman Beyer, but apparently 40 co-sponsors. As Ms. Strong, you noted that you said excludes, but I think what you meant is prohibits seclusion from being used. So I was a little thrown off a little bit. That is a very important component of what can be the impact on not just the 10th largest school system in the country, but all school systems around the country. If we are trying to ensure that our most vulnerable students are kept safe, absolutes, we know sometimes, are actually even more harmful. So I know Mr. McElveen said, what's the plan if this act passes? Sometimes we know best intentioned legislation is bad legislation in the way it's written. And so I don't think as a 10th largest school system in the country, we should be sitting on our hands without communicating, whether it's with Congressman Beyer or anybody. So I take it really seriously that we need to be partnering with our community advocates, with these national organizations I've mentioned, because even when I had the meeting with the national organization, they're not saying you can never use seclusion. They recognize at times that is in the best interest and safety of that child. And so I will say as a next step, I think it's extremely urgent that we get clarity on, is this a problem? The other thing is I want to thank Ms. Corbett-Sanders, our chair, because while we've had this meeting, she forwarded to all of us that in January, our staff did a crosswalk on what FCPS's guidelines are for restraint and seclusion, and then what's the VDOE, and then what's the CASA, and then how does this impact? That is probably how we should have spent a good portion of tonight's work session, and we'll need to be having, I think, a very timely follow-up work session, because what's happening with this crosswalk and what I'm reading, we've got to be more proactive as a system. And again, I hope for all the advocates listening, we want to learn and partner with you to get the best legislation possible, but we already know we deal with bad legislation that comes out of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I mean, really bad legislation. And the federal government right now on chronic absenteeism, bad legislation out of the Department of Education, really harmful to best practice in instruction. So anyway, the other thing I wanted to share with my visit today is the seclusion room, at least at Laurel Ridge, the key for locking that door, the staff member has to stand there with their hand on that key. And the moment you take your hand off the key, the door is no longer locked. So they don't lock the door unless they're asking the student, and communicating with the student. So I want everybody to know that it's not like you put a kid in a room, lock the door, and walk away. I mean, you hands off so hopefully what it means is it's rarely, if ever, used, and only, again, in a matter of safety for the student. But more to learn.
Okay, Ms. Schultz?
So I'm really glad that my colleague, Ms. McLaughlin, brought up the instance of good practice and our principal here. That's the point of the disaggregation of the data. Is I think there are probably pockets of excellence that will be revealed by disaggregating it, and that's exactly the point. The other point is that I don't know what data you're collecting, but I spent a good portion of my day working with a family whose autistic child, it's a nice name, eloped. I don't think it's nice because that means the child has left school. And so there's the opposite problem of not practicing seclusion or not practicing these, this oversight. And so I don't know if that will be revealed to us as well in whatever report, but we have to understand these things. And Dr. Brabrand, you said this about accountability structures. Well, we're the accountability. That it is the board's responsibility to decide to hold the superintendent and thus the rest of the system accountable. And so this is why I'm saying the development of the policy has to be ours, because we drive the accountability. If we're not asking you for the reports and you're not delivering the reports, we can't hold you and the system accountable. So that's very important, because we have 188,204 students who are not secluded and restrained. And so when we're talking to SEPTA, when we're talking to ACSD, the other thing in bringing voices to the table is students have very powerful voices, and peers to peers of the students who are in school with students that have been secluded and restrained, that's an important voice. We're the voices that can come to the table that can give us insight of observing their peers. And I will tell you, as a parent of an 11-year-old, and I have multiple IEP children, but I have an 11-year-old who is a Cat B student, and he's very intuitive, particularly about the students with autism in his school. And when he heard the news story, it was on the news, and he turned around and he said, "That's dumb." That's the 11-year-old view of, I have peers in school, and it is dumb. Like, he sees that the students in his school who have autism are treated differently. So when he observed that being reported, that through the mouths of babes, that was wrong to him. And those are the peers of these other students. We need to bring more voices and find a way to bring more voices to the table. I think that's important. And I hate to clarify this, and I know this is not a popular point to make. We have not had budget cuts. We have not cut our budget. We may not have grown our budget as much as we wanted to, but this becomes, too, the priority of this board to drive where money's going. It is up to this board to make these decisions. I've made multiple budget amendments in the past to drive money to certain places, and the board hasn't wanted to do it. But this is our budget when it comes down to it, and we decide where the money goes. And if we want to fix a problem, we're going to have to make choices about where we spend money and where we don't. But that's the accountability of that, frankly, is with the public to us, and taking care of directing money where it needs to go.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. Ms. Keys-Gamarra, and then we're going to go to next steps.
Well, I want to share a story, and I won't, because I want to make sure that we include this when we do this study. And I visited the school, I won't give the name, but I ended up having to wait for the principal because he was chasing a kid down the hill. He came back sweating bullets. He and the assistant principal it took to, and they called the mother, very cooperative. They called the police. The police did a fantastic job, but they've been dealing with this all year, and they've been calling for supports, and it hasn't been dealt with. And I say this to say that we also need to be looking at what isn't working as we have students that need these services. And I understand that we're dealing with restraint and seclusion, but that kid put himself in danger. And our staff members got a serious workout that day. And they didn't mind. I mean, I was, very pleased with what I saw in the school in terms of our staff members and what they were willing to do. But we need to make sure that we're serving We're making sure that we're dealing with these kinds of things. They've been waiting for a placement since school started for this young man. So he's obviously not in the right place. And so I want to make sure that we consider some of this as we have this task force and this study.
Thank you, Ms. Keys-Gamarra. Ms. Medea, can you put up next steps, please?
I have a question because I brought this up first. The question is, how are we going to do this? How functionally would this next step, the first next step, happen? Is it something that would be drafted by staff and then come to us? Does it come, like, how do... I have a question about how this is going to happen to understand what would happen. A new board policy. I've never been here where we've kind of created out of thin air a new board policy. Oh.
That's not good.
To exemplify why I would like a primer on how this would happen.
Ms. Schultz, traditionally, when the board takes on the development of a new policy, we refer it to governance and they draft something. Right. So if I can suggest that in this case, what we would want is to have staff, Dr. Brabrand, provide a draft of the policy and provide it to governance for review and actually set a time frame for which this needs to be done because of the sense of the real urgency.
Now we've come to the nut of why I asked this. I would like to add to this, and we can vote on it, but I would like to add specifically that it be drafted by staff in concert with or in communication with ACSD, SEPTA, and other, others, and then provided to governance. I want that very specifically laid out. Instead of disappearing into a black hole like sometimes things do, I want to understand very specifically that we're directing the superintendent staff to direct it, that it is going to be done in concert with advocates in the community, and that it's going to come back to governance for review.
I would actually suggest that this is one of the first things that the task force that we're putting together, if this board supports a task force, that task force would do so. And one of the fundamental questions is whether or not it is a seclusion and restraint policy, or is it a behavioral management policy? Because it's not clear that we have full consensus on whether or not seclusion is something that is fully supported by the community and the board. And so that's why we need to look at best practices in today's world versus when in 2009.
I don't think we should be prescribing the answer.
That's why I'm asking.
I think it needs to go out and be included, but I think it also needs to include reporting back to the board.
Correct.
So I want, this is the most, to me, this is the most important step because it's what's been missing and we can't have the accountability. So anybody can mess with that language if they like, but.
Can I just get some clarification, because we do believe that Virginia regs are going to be approved in the next few months. Is that correct, Jane? So just thinking of the timeline, I would ask that we consider waiting until those regs are complete.
I think that you can build a policy, a draft policy that just provides for that it's going to be in concert with state regulations. I don't think that it's necessary to wait until the state gets around to doing something. Right. This is overdue, in my opinion.
Can I just suggest the board, its next steps, tell us what your next steps are, and I can object or push hard back or just modify. You guys get your consensus first on what you want, and then
that's what we typically do. And so if you can give us a bit of time, we will be, it's a bit like making sausage. We're trying to figure out how to craft the language, and then we'll see if we have consensus around it. Yes, Ms. Strauss?
Yeah, I would recommend that staff and the superintendent begin working on this. I think that there is a need to move on this.
Correct.
I don't want to wait for a huge task force to work. That could be months. Certainly, I suspect in the process, the state will do their piece. I don't want to wait months for this. I agree with Mrs. Schultz that this is something that needs to be done. We need to begin the discussion to get it going. And a policy is generally shorter, and it's the regulation of the guidelines that then define the details. That takes more time. But I do think that we need a policy sooner rather
That's
than
an
later.
excellent point, Ms. Strauss. And it could be that you decide, Dr. Braybrand or Ms. Johnson, that you can only bring back a draft policy and a draft of reporting to the board, but that you may say to us, look, we're going to do the draft policy, but the underpinning regulations which enforce the policy will come on the heels of the, you may.
Got it.
You may. You see?
Yeah, okay. And Ms. McLaughlin has a comment on this as well.
As someone who's been a part of governance, I think going on 5 years now and come through with a lot of brand new policy and sometimes revised policy, I do agree with the expediency of having staff draft it. However, I would say that there is at least need to be a skeleton of what the regulations might look like. Again, that has a little more time and has the ability that we absolutely need to have our stakeholders in it. But the reason I say that is because when we were dealing with the cell tower policy, the naming rights policy, when the policy is seen in isolation, and Ms. Schultz, you're a big one on data and context, policy and context, you want to at least have an idea from staff. Okay, and we did it with the TJ policy too, by the way, TJ admissions policy. We needed the regulations to see it, and even though everything can be in draft, I just don't want to see a policy in a vacuum.
And I would urge people to know that there's not only a state regulation being developed on this, but there's also a consultation at the federal level on this issue. So there are a lot of moving parts, but getting a skeleton out there where we know the policy should reflect the core values, and that's what we need to have.
Ms. Corbett-Sanders, that's exactly why I'm saying I want to do it now, because it's going to, first of all, this is going to take time. We've got a grant that it's going to take the superintendent and staff time to work within the community to put, the skeleton together, and the meat of it may come when the state regulations are ready, but we have to begin the process now, so.
We understand that. That's the first one. Let's go ahead. Let's go ahead through all of the next steps first, and then we will, because I think you're going to find that there's some redundancy, and I also believe that there are some that have maybe fallen off that we want to make sure they're on here.
Well,
so,
Mr. The
Moon.
first one, though, that needs to be cleaned up. It says to draft a policy. It needs to say a policy on what? I think that's down below now, seclusion and restraint, and I thought the idea was that we were not going to do it in conjunction with the task force because we wanted to hurry up.
It's in communication with community stakeholders, so not the conjunction of the task force.
I just think the language, direct staff to draft a policy on board, on seclusion and restraint in communication with ACSD and SEPTA, and submit it to the governance committee.
Period, right?
Can I suggest that it's actually behavior intervention strategies and...
I don't care what we call it.
Okay. That may...
And can we do, and submit to governance, we need to include reporting to board and supporting regulations. So draft a policy on behavior intervention, comma, seclusion and restraint, comma, reporting to board, and supporting regulations, and then the rest is fine through the period. And then take off the second sentence.
In communication, in consultation with, isn't it? And there is a new organization?
How they're going to report this information to the board? What's the mechanism by which we're going to have a reporting out? Like annual reports, quarterly reports?
And it should just say,
You're trying to say you want a policy that will include how they will report out to us.
I don't know if the reporting is going to be included in the policy. That's why I called it out specifically. Like, I don't know if our policies typically include the reporting mechanics.
As well as reporting out to the board.
Yeah, that's fine.
and there are a couple of stray words at the end of that. Yeah.
Well, which we don't need the wordsmith as long as staff
Well,
understands the crux.
Well, we need to get it right before we vote on it, so, yeah. and submit to governance committee, yeah.
Correct.
All right.
Okay. So, Mr. Moon, how long is it going to, let's.
Okay.
No, I want to make sure we catch them all. Mr. Moon, are
okay,
you
number
okay with
two, first of all, the instances, I think it's instances in the as it, because that's the language used in the slide. And I think I did make a request for all the recommendations. I want to see FY20 budgetary impacts so that we could deliver on them.
You mean saying identify
budgetary impacts?
FY20.
FY20 budgetary impacts.
Of what?
I was going to say, can I ask for the world? But is there some
The
in
recommendation,
our recommendations,
your
based
recommendations.
on what that's going to cost, based on our reporting out now?
Absolutely.
So are you talking about the budgetary impacts of additional training and staffing to address these?
Everything that was presented to us as their recommendations and their budgetary impacts for FY20.
Understood.
Yeah.
Because I have heard from my colleagues that basically overall support for their recommendations, but we need to know whether it's $1 million, $10 million, if it's $10 million, which one, where will the money be coming from?
So, Mr. Moon, are you asking, rather than having it as a single number, can we have the budgetary impacts disaggregated by each?
Absolutely, by each item.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure we got
that. Could be a
that.
budget question.
I'm sorry, can I clarify, are you talking about the recommendations that are on slide 12?
All the presentation, all the recommendation, the presentation.
Including those that have been added.
Thank you. I just wanted to know, out of those 679 instances, how many were notified to parent? It sounded as if they were using that it should be, yeah, it should be 100%, but I want to know.
That's fine, went through my mind.
Mike.
I just want to know. I just want to.
I know you want to know that, so I guess I'm saying I would tack on to your number 2.
How they
just
were
that I want
notified.
confirmation of not just parent notification on these documented cases, but what are the overall practices throughout the system for parent notification? Because it sounds like there's different practices. Some are send a form
That's
home.
fine if a staff
Yeah.
can do that, whether it was done by email.
I'm not asking them to know for those specific cases. I just want you to kind of provide to us what you're hearing out of our X number of schools. What is their practice? And put it into a bucket. 60% send a form home. 40% call the parents. I want to know what that looks like.
Okay.
We can do that.
Thank you. Your next one is Ms. Hines.
It's fine.
Okay. Ms. Evans?
So does staff understand what I'm looking for here?
I
You know,
do.
how many are one instance, how many?
How many kids is 1? How many kids is 10? How many kids is 50?
And
How many
how high
kids
up
is
does it
100
go?
plus?
Can we
How-
just
yeah.
expand that language? That was what I was talking about on providing disaggregated information for the seclusion and restraint instances.
Well,
I mean, how many were?
Hang on a second, Elizabeth. Let's. I think that's a separate issue.
But I think you're talking basically about the quality or the severity or whatever of
talking about the quantity.
She wants a frequency chart by kids.
So why don't? So I
basically.
think yours is probably lower down. Yeah, because I'm just looking for how many of those 203 had one instance. How many had 2? How many had 10? How many had 450?
Yep.
Provide the range of restraint and seclusion incidences per student.
Per
and
school.
Do you want per school as well?
Per school. If you do that, then you've disaggregated and you understand where it's happening and to whom.
So if there are more frequent occurrences at an individual site, then that may indicate that it requires a deeper dive at that site. Yeah.
Well,
because we're all going to vote on it. Well, I know, but I don't have. Yeah. So, Ms. Evans.
Well, I'm just, so Elizabeth, are you just looking for the same data per school rather than per student?
Yes. So if we have it disaggregated by student and by school, we will understand, is this a discrete problem?
No, I understand your point. I'm just asking you if that's what you're looking for.
Right. And yes.
So, yes. But I just don't want to lose what the data that I'm looking for, which is to see how many have one instance and how many have 205 and how many have 450.
But could not one, Ms. Evans, this is the other problem with that, if one is like a very, like a lot, like an hour or half the day, and so the like I don't know if there's a way for us to talk about the severity.
So that's a different question.
Okay. Okay, Mr. McElveen?
So I think this kind of needs to be paired with our historical investigation of, why did we, well, no, not necessarily, but, from a staff report to the board on, what were personnel responsible for this and why, just to answer this question, why did we not have guidelines until 2012?
Okay, and the next one?
That is fine. It should be avert, A-V-E-R-T.
What kind of crises?
No, to avert seclusion and restraint, yeah.
Was that the question if the law passes HB?
I think that's probably further down.
No, I think this is what sort of practice, what type of training for interventions to.
We can certainly, the types of.
It's how to intercede before it becomes a crisis.
Correct, yes.
Is that what you're trying to do?
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
Can we just say what type of training will be provided to prevent
de-escalating.
Yeah.
To prevent students from having a crisis that would require restraint and seclusion.
Yes, perfect. Then number 8 looks fine to me.
How will the external independent audit, RFP? Just.
Well, external, it would naturally be independent, yeah.
Well, not naturally.
Okay.
So, Ms. Strauss, number 9.
I just want to make sure that it's to be able to see progress and improvement, what's working.
Oh, you're talking about individual student growth.
Individual student growth, because that's obviously what we're after. Is behavior, right. Exactly. Children. Behavior progress, progress with communication, whatever.
Would you be behavior and communication progress?
I think maybe just behavior. Okay. And we'll leave it at that. And I guess if that's possible, because that's really what we're looking for. How do we hold
I think, right.
it will be challenging. I think we will have some discussion, and Janie will answer that question.
Right, thank you.
Okay, the next one.
I think it was mine. So I think whichever task force we decide to do, and the ombudsman position. So here, it looks like you've created some handbooks, so if we could maybe know what those are, and know which ones are being worked on, and the input from whichever community group we decide to create, definitely the ones that are existing. And it sounded like also around, you have transitions, right? So supports around transitions. So anything you've worked on, and can I assume that all of these are being translated as well, or does that need to be in there?
I'll have to check into that.
Okay, so language translation for that would be helpful. And so, bless you. Okay, yeah, Ms. Schultz, did you have a question about that?
I just have a question about this notion of a task force. Like, I'm not exactly understanding how this would be different than ACSD, and SEPTA has, representation on ACSD, because that's the state. Their mandate by the state is basically a gap analysis. The difference between what we're doing and what we should be doing. What's missing.
I get that. So my concern is we've had ACSD and we've had these problems. And so I just want to make sure that whatever group, and I know there are different ideas, the task force is what was presented in the presentation. So we need to have a group that includes parents and independent eyes looking at the work, ensuring that we are working with the ombudsman, that we have the supports in place and the accountability. That structure, I think we need to define what it will be.
This is broader than ACSD. ACSD has been a very successful supportive organization of the system, but this really is looking to having a more intentional ongoing dialogue with a broader community, specialized focus beyond just those that are at the table on ACSD, to include our mental health professionals, our supports that come from the county, as well as the much needed voice from the community. And it's a broader group than just what's represented at ACSD.
I'm just talking about in conjunction with our governance manual. The mechanism that we have, if we're going to do something, is to create an ad hoc committee. So an ad hoc committee would be for a certain period of time for a specific reason, because we don't have a standing committee for this, and this is not a state mandate. So this would be
So I would
something
suggest
else.
start with an ad hoc committee, and then if we have to modify our governance committee to have a standing, or governance manual to have a standing committee, we can always do that. But
Right.
start with an ad hoc committee then.
So what I want to know is when we vote for this, that says community task force and a position, and I can't vote for that, but I don't want to not vote for the right thing. And if it's explore a ad hoc committee of the board, then that fits into our governance structure, and then that's okay.
I think Ms. Palchik's is clarifying.
Fine, these were both words that were used, positions that were presented by staff, so it was just whichever group, and I know there were others recommended that they should be, in addition to the work that is tasked, looking at the handbooks and supports that exist and that need to be created so that parents across the board know where to go and what processes to expect.
It wouldn't hurt tonight, just being real, to know exactly what kind of task force you want so that we don't start pulling people, or is it an ad hoc committee of the board or an advisory group or a task force? The more specific you are for us, I think the better we'll be making sure we get it right out of the gate for the way
Right, because if this is a community task force, is it you're taking it over?
That's kind of what I think we need to decide. That's why, all I'm asking for is the clarification. I'm fine either way, but I think it's important so that we don't we're on the same page right now, and I want to stay on the same page before the evening ends on this topic.
I don't think the evening's going to end quite yet, but if we can, Ms. Palchik, if I can ask for it to be established an ad hoc committee to address the concerns of the community in how to best support our students with disabilities. By bringing issues of concern to the board with potential solutions. Something like that, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I think they should decide how to gather input on concerns from the community, and I guess I don't know who'll be leading this, but to help.
I mean, this is what ACSD does. So you will have two simultaneous communities. So that's for your consideration. But I do have concerns about two committees reporting to the board. Are they the same issues? I mean, I think this is an issue that could go to ACSD and would be a great goal for next year, a charge for next year. To take a much broader look at it and a system-wide look and take the time to really invest and have their small committees work on it. I don't think
we have time to wait until next year to give them a charge on this. I really think that there needs to be a committee brought together sooner rather than later, and it has to be broader than the existing ACSD. That's why SEPTA has come into existence. It's why the Coalition on Trauma-Informed Schools has come into existence. It's why there's a cry in the community to be heard, and so we need to put together a mechanism that allows us to listen to the community and work with them to address their concerns.
Then you're talking about the superintendent, directing the superintendent to do something, because an ad hoc committee of the board is the only way that we could do it as a board. So if you're directing the superintendent to go out and create something, then we're going to have to tell him tonight what we want him to create before we can vote on it, because I got to know what we're asking them to do, and we got to hear from staff if they're able to do it in the time frame that we're asking them to do it before we can vote on it.
Madam Chair, can I ask a question?
I have Ms. Hines and then Ms. Evans.
So how is this ad hoc committee going to be different than our advisory committee on students with disabilities if this is as broad as it sounds in here?
It is different because it's more specialized. It brings in the community groups from the Fairfax County government, their social workers, the Community Services Board. It kind of builds on what started as the Welcome and Inclusion Network Task Force, which is now completed, and really putting together the structures that gets everybody in the room to make sure that we provide the full supports to these families. That's why I'm saying we want the experts in the room on this.
If I could, because it's 9:10 too, and I'm not 9:10 that we can't spend more time, but just how people's minds, at least my mind, goes later in the day. Our recommendations talked about a set of actions around community engagement that said existing group, explore other groups. Within that set of recommendations, you could direct the superintendent to form a group with both existing and exploring other community and other partners to report back by a certain date. I mean, that's just one suggestion. You all will decide whether that's the one you want. But we could do that, for example, taking some of those recommendations and pulling them together to pull a task, an advisory group.
Right. Forming a group to address these needs. I have Ms. McLaughlin, followed by Ms. Hines, and then Ms. Strauss.
Just quickly, I think it's absolutely important to do the ad hoc committee. You want to have the people who are experts specifically in this subject area. Our ACSD appointees, that's not how they are. It's not necessarily even a holistic, yeah, exactly. You need subject matter experts on restraint and seclusion, including the community and special education teachers, to focus just on this. And also as a vehicle for which the community can be deeply involved. Our advisory committee structure is not set up for the community engagement piece.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Mr. Moon.
I think we seem to have at least 26. Next is now 30.
Okay.
And if we could expedite the discussion and make some
I will
decisions.
do that. So,
And, if I want to give a feedback on this one, I think it may be prudent for the board to direct the superintendent to form either ad hoc committee or task force to engage the community groups as he see fits to address, and then bring back to the board with the recommendations. I mean, it's going to be his work, because we're not going to be doing, the board is not going to be doing it. Superintendent's going to do that, correct? Isn't that your intention? Since
I'm the one who brought the issue to the. My intention is that the board is not going to be doing the work, but that the work has to be done, and it has to be done broader than the existing committees that we have today.
Correct.
And it has to be one that looks at this as being a symptom, which is the concerns over the constraint or the restraint and seclusion, but it's really creating.
I agree. I am prepared to support that.
Then let's just have the superintendent to form this ad hoc committee to address the concerns of the community and make sure that it's reported back to the board.
Yes.
I'm fine with that.
Thank you.
History stands, this board itself had a student discipline task force. That's because then we had independent voices. So I totally disagree punting this to the superintendent on this issue.
So
can I just want to say, we're talking about forming a task force and directing the superintendent to do it. That's prescribing the solution. I don't even know that that's the solution. I think we need to give the superintendent the space to be able to go talk to these groups and potentially create a safe environment for teachers who may fear retribution and parents who fear retribution. We don't even know what needs to happen, but we need to direct him and have him have the ability with his staff to go start the conversation, allow parents to be heard before prescribing the fact that it should be a task force. Maybe it isn't a task force. Maybe it is a series of listening tours by the superintendent about this issue. Maybe that's what they want. But I'm worried that we're trying to force a solution at 9:15 at night about how it should happen when none of the conversation has actually necessarily begun.
Madam Chair, since we have authority, I don't know at this point, I don't know what you are doing, whether we are just looking at the advocates of this next steps language, and then we're going to come back and do one at a time, or are we discussing right now?
So my objective was to get through the wording and then go back and vote on each individual one. But given that we are only on item number 11, this is an issue which runs to the crux of where do we go from here, which is how do we ensure that we continue to get the input from a very important part of our community, and that we are actually not always on the reactionary approach, but rather proactively engaging with this community, understanding what the concerns are of the community, and addressing those concerns. Yes, Ms. Palchik, and then I'm going to move on.
Thank you. This was my point. I mean, I would feel comfortable to say, have the superintendent, it looks like he met with the groups and the advocates once, meet again, and in a very short term, I don't know how long you need, come back and recommend the next steps for the work. I'm okay with that if we can be on board with superintendent, go talk to the groups and come back, I don't know, in a week, 2 weeks, and say this is how we're going forward. I'm okay with either one of those, but this is...
Let's move on. Okay, I would say have the superintendent come back with a recommendation on how best to
and hopefully
have an ongoing dialogue and have an ongoing dialogue or communication with this community to identify concerns and solutions. Something like that, because I don't want it to be, oh, we're only going to focus on just this issue today, and then we have another crisis coming up before us in 6 months. It's much better to proactively address these concerns when they come to us, and we need to have a mechanism in which the community does come to us. Yes, so Ms. Hines?
Just going to say, I think we can move on with that, and if we want something else later, we can always build something later, right?
Okay, it's got to be more than just the community, though. It has to have the community and other stakeholders providing services. Huh? And other stakeholders. Okay.
A clarification, if I may.
Please do.
I know it's late, and I know everybody wants to go home, and I sympathize with that, but we're in a crisis, and my concern is that we need, those stakeholders have to include our county partners. This needs to be looked at through the One Fairfax lens. We need to get that information, and so I'm hoping that that's what you mean by stakeholders.
Absolutely mean the community partners, and I also see it as an ongoing, beyond just this one issue. And so if you want to put my name next to that with Ms. Patrick.
It's okay.
Okay.
That's why I want to make sure, because it is late, that we know who those partners are so we can all be on board before it happens and we feel like
if you can trust the chair to work with the superintendent to make sure we get all the stakeholders at the table, I think that would be the way to do it.
Yes, and trust the superintendent that we listened tonight. We've listened to you tonight. We said a recommendation was to explore other partners, and we will. And if you find that I don't do what I said I would do in these recommendations, that you'll hold me accountable. That's part of trust was broken. And you have to decide whether you believe I, as superintendent, can restore the trust or not. I'm here and I'm committed with the staff to do the right thing for these students. So I'm fine if you all want to do it as a committee, but I'm more than welcome to take this information, go back and come up with an ongoing way, a vehicle for dialogue with the community stakeholders that we need around this specific issue.
Okay.
I'm comfortable with 12.
13.
Yes. As long as you guys understand what my concern is.
15, 17, okay.
Yes.
Teresa, give me something though. Thumbs up or whatever on if there's anything wording. Okay.
I'm thinking all of it is more asking a question and then you get an opportunity to come back and address those concerns. So I'm not seeing it as I'm telling you what to do. I'm telling you what my concern is. Okay?
We're going to presume they're okay.
And Teresa, just as you and your staff are looking, if there's something on there that we think, that we know right now, we can always come back and say later, we can't, or there's an issue. But if there's something hot off the press right now at 9:20, tell us, and we can still tweak it. So I don't want to rush out so much that we don't get something right, or that we know we can't get that, or if that makes sense.
And if we need to outreach and ask additional clarifying questions, we certainly will do that as well.
Which one are we on, or you just
We're letting
asking us to
Mr.
look
Wilson take a look at his. Mr. Wilson, are you?
Yeah, I think it's just provide more information. I think we did get information already, so it's just really more detailed information about what happens in the circumstances of these multiple incident cases.
And Mr. Wilson, can we include and the involvement, specify the involvement of parents in this process? Ms. Schultz, on number 24, because 22 and 23 I'm fine with. Number 24, haven't we already addressed that with Ms. Evans?
Well, I don't know. I'm thinking that staff understands, but
I understand what you're asking, and some of the data that the way you want it disaggregated will come about as of the result of the CRDC reporting out. It just may take some time, and I'm looking at Mary Beth Leftglass back there. But we should have more demographic breakdown and further information.
Right. So Ms. Evans was only asking, like, on a per student basis, like how many. So, like, I can imagine a little grid that says, you know, one student had, you know, 10 incidents. 17 students had between, you know, 2 and 10 incidents, you know, and such. This is more who and where, you know, to understand, is it boys who are being restrained and secluded? Is it boys, you know, boys of color who are being restrained and secluded? Is it elementary age? So if we don't disaggregate the data, we're not understanding where the problem is. And I think that there may be, like, microcosms of a problem where maybe it isn't a problem everywhere, but it's a problem somewhere or for some kids.
And we committed in our presentation to work to disaggregate the data with the equity lens, the exact lens that you're talking about with those breakdowns: school, gender, race,
and a little bit, this may get to Mrs. Strauss's issue that if predominantly it's elementary and middle school but not high school, does that mean that they're growing out of the behavior, or is it consistently across all levels? So I don't feel like I need to explain to you what you already know. I think
got it.
The data that we're currently working on to report on the April 22nd is by school, by race, by sex. So it does. The Office for Civil Rights does not use FRM, but other than that, we have those other categories are part of what we're working on for the civil rights submission at the end of April.
So the fact that it includes by school, that by default means by grade level.
Right. So that would give you elementary, middle, and high. Okay. We're doing it by school.
All right. Great. Look, I mean, we can only ask for data that we can do something with, so we don't want more data than we need, but it's a good place to start because we've been missing fundamentally this level of data.
Excellent. Ms. McLaughlin, do you want to include that up with the earlier statement on including external stakeholders, additional stakeholders? You're number 25. And if we go back up to the number 11, I would say communication and consultation, but, you know, our other stakeholders would include ANOVA. Is that what you're suggesting?
Sure. I don't know until I could see to the next screen where it also included the other organizations I listed out.
Well, that's the only one we see at this point, so that's why I'm...
Yeah, I mean, honestly,
I
feel bad because I know staff had to capture up 30 things, but, I mean, it's disappointing because I went through a lot of time talking tonight about the different stakeholders, and now we'll just have to try to capture it now.
It's COPA, it's the social...
It's the Education Advocacy Consulting Group. Thank you.
Yeah. That's why I'm suggesting that the whole list of additional stakeholders should be built into the one above.
Right.
And if we can just say...
Except for that, I mean, the first one, I mean, we're rewriting number 11. 11 was communication. This one I was specifically saying part of the consulting efforts.
It's actually communication and consultation is what 11 should be. It's that broader work.
I don't care, as long as we capture who I think he should consider consulting with.
Okay, so let's go ahead.
Well, yeah, staff hasn't captured it yet. So it's Inova Hospital, and then it's COPA, COPAA, and then it's EAC, which I guess, Teresa, you know who I'm talking about. Okay.
I would also say Fairfax County Government Services, so the CSB.
Sure. Although, I mean, yeah, it's fine. I assumed staff will decide all the people they want to consult with. These are ones that have come to mind that have more of a national advocacy level, but they also happen to be located in the area.
Okay.
We're not voting on this. We're having to go to read what they are. Oh my God, I'm getting
Now
dizzy.
you're at,
So I don't think I asked for a work session, you guys. I just said that I think we're having the superintendent report back to us on providing the clarity and process. Well, I'm going to say for everybody's sake, it's okay that they'll put it into the bucket it belongs to. So that might just be easier than back and forth, because these are at the end.
so direct superintendent.
To provide clarity. I was process. Right, clarity.
The ombudsman our position?
No, it's in
Okay.
his shop, which is for a longer conversation, another point in time. For the ombudsman, no, reporting out concerns related to special education cases.
Friends too. Okay.
Sure. Do you understand the sentiment? Yeah, I'm just saying.
The next one.
I'm sure you'll clarify it. I got it.
Oh, not me, no.
And Ms. McLaughlin, number 27.
Not so Megan, yeah. I wasn't saying amend the legislative package. I was saying review. Review federal and state legislation.
State proposed legislation.
Yeah, state proposed legislation and or regulations.
Mm-hmm.
So that the board can effectively advocate. Yep, there you go. Because I think staff knows the federal and, it's the CASA Act is part of that. We don't need to list it out.
Ms. Keys-Gamarra, do you want to do the next one?
Oh, wait.
Oh.
What? So we need to, delete from bill all the way to advocate. There we go.
Leave advocate.
Yeah, keep advocate. There we go, period. So we can effectively advocate.
Okay, 28 is there for discussion purposes, so that the board can have a clear understanding of what the needs are.
Okay.
So that's fine.
Yeah, I don't know that that captures what I was getting at. It's really to sort of create a place in the improvement plan to think about and to come up with ways to make parent involvement more appropriate and connected to the decisions that are being made with regards to their child. Because what I get from the community is that they're very frustrated. So I don't know exactly how that gets written, but that's what I'm talking about. So it's really you've got a multi-categorical improvement plan. I think one category needs to be the parent and the family in that process.
What do you want it to say, really? What do you want it to say?
I think what you... Yeah.
Yes.
Family
To
engagement.
include and support special education parents.
That's part of the task.
Yeah, that seems fine. Yeah, that's good.
Okay, number 30.
Yeah, so report on principal and administrator I guess, current and proposed training and plan for accountability up through, I guess, the schools all the way up to the regions. I don't know if that makes sense. Because currently, I think we said it's only a recommendation, right? But the plan.
And share accountability plan for schools.
Right. Beautiful. Too late for me.
Tell you, you know, kind of get on a roll.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I'm good to go. Wait, what are staff? No. Sorry, this is not yet. What is our plan in the event that Bill 7124 passes? HR 7124. HB, sorry, yeah. Oh, HR, yeah.
I'm sorry, we missed on the time, keeping the board apprised of the timeline for the filing of the corrected federal reports. The fall, like, that's just out there. I think you need to have a way to report back to us the status of the corrected federal report filings.
We also have, there was the question of the review of all OCR data points for accuracy.
Yeah, we were going to do that.
It's not up there.
Does it have to be a next step?
Broader than just this.
Yeah, I think you brought up
it.
Going beyond just this, right?
Fine. I know it's thousands. We're putting everything in the next steps, right? Okay, just review all OCR reporting since whenever. Since we have, how long have we been, 2012? Since 2012? You know, to ensure we have not been misreporting anything else.
Yeah. To ensure accuracy.
Accuracy and?
It's an E, an ensure.
Accuracy, is that good enough? Okay.
Okay.
So could I ask a superintendent what sort of work we're talking about when you have to go back to 2012, and is it hundreds of items for each report, or?
300. There's 300,000 fields of data per report. 300,000 fields of data.
So 300,000 fields of data
per submission.
Per submission, and we do that every other year?
Every other year.
Every other year, so which means we do about 1 million entries?
Okay, well, that's too much work. What if we did a spot check?
What we've been doing, I'll just let you know what we've been doing really the last couple of weeks, is we have looked at any areas where we have reported zeros. And so we have found 3 other areas where we have reported zeros, and we've been working with the cabinet and with the associated departments who give us that information and we've reviewed these. I can also tell you that the documentation on the requirements for the report is thousands of pages in terms of how the requirements are for the reporting. So we've been working with each of those offices for those 3 areas that we've historically reported zeros to ensure that those zeros are indeed accurate. So that's the area that we've been focusing on to ensure that our data is accurate. Starting with 17-18 data, which we're about to report.
I think that makes sense. I also think, and this is difficult though, this sounds difficult, but if we could benchmark not only places where we've reported 0, but where our reporting has been kind of out of whack with other districts, so again, this sounds like a very wide and deep dive.
I would also like to tell you that much of the other data we are able to get from our student information system. This particular data on seclusion and restraint has been on paper forms, and that's one of the reasons that it's been very difficult to report on. And so much of our other data, and we're going to be adding that into the student information system this coming school year, which will make it much more accurate and easier to report. Much of our other data is about numbers of kids and different kinds of programs and things, and that's coming out of our student information system, which is much more reliable and accurate. And so I just wanted to share that with you.
All right, well, why don't we, for now, can we change it to just say, not review all, but review OCR reporting since 2000, what, 14?
There are three submissions, 13, 14, 15, 16, and our current 17, 18, which we're about to report, that we're working on reviewing this information.
Okay, so since 15, 16 to 13, 14, okay. Let's do 15, 16, to check for accuracy. I know. So review. Yeah, but anything we do, can we?
To check for aberrations, how about that? To just check for aberrations. If we see something that doesn't seem, that's what Mary Beth was already trying to do. She went back and pulled zeros. We'll see if there's anything else that looks out of whack beyond zeros being reported.
Let's start with that, to check for aberrations, and we'll see where we get with that. Okay. I mean, there might be another way to do it, but let's come back.
To check for validation. That's a good.
No, ABB.
Norm.
Right?
Validation and aberrations. ABBER. ATIONS.
Aberrations. So let's
and validations.
Oh, we didn't spell that right.
It's 1B.
1B and 2 R's? Aha.
I got the spelling bee. Okay. So, and we have another one from Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
This one is really quick. I don't think I saw it up there where it says, I wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to survey staff and parents.
It is.
It's in there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go back up. I think it is. Bev, isn't there one right there? Conduct survey of staff members and parents. Keys-Gamarra.
So based on that, we've clarified all the language. Is there, from staff, before we go through this, is there anything here that you think there's just no way you can do it?
It is almost 10 o'clock.
I know that.
I would ask for the opportunity that I talk to the superintendent and the deputy so that if there's something we can't do. I just have a question about the survey, but I'm happy to reach out to Karen Keys-Gamarra and ask for clarification tomorrow.
Okay, so based on that, if I can get the support of the board to adopt all of these follow-on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that passes. Thank you. And with that, I am going to close this work session. Thank you all for your patience and support, and I love that. That's the way we should be ending this meeting.